Okay, my brother, you're good. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, and Housing convenes this public hearing. Public hearing notice was given to the media on Friday, December 20th, and on December 30th, and on January 7th, Tuesday, and the time now is 9 o'clock. The committee will hear and accept testimony, both oral and written, on the following bills. Bill 246-35 LS, sponsored by myself, co-sponsored by Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes, Senator Jose Pito Terlay, an act to amend subsection A4 of section 61542 of chapter 61, title 21, Guam Code Annotated, to amend subsection B of section 3102.3 of Chapter 3, Title 17, Guam Code Annotated, to add a new subsection H to Section 3101.3 to Chapter 13 of Title 16, Guam Code Annotated, to amend Section 40108 of Chapter 40 of Title 5, Guam Code Annotated, to amend subsection A of Section 1000 of Chapter 10, Title 1, Guam Code Annotated, to amend Section 1117 and add a new Section 1124 to Chapter 1 to repeal and reenact Section 2110, add a new Section 2111 and Section 2112 to Chapter 2, add a new subsection G to Section 3102.1, amend Section 3104 and 3105 of Chapter 3, amend Section 6105 and 6108 and 6110 of Chapter 6, amend Section 9112 and amend subsection B1 of Section 912 of Chapter 9, amend 11115 of Chapter 11, add a new Section 13110 to Chapter 13, amend Section 14105 of Chapter 14, repeal Section 15206 of Chapter 15, amend subsection A of 16209, amend subsection A of Section 16306 and add a new Section 16313 to Chapter 16 of Title 3, Guam Code Annotated, relative to reinforcing Guam election and campaign laws. Also, Bill 233-35 COR, sponsored by Vice Speaker Talina Nelson, co-sponsored by myself, an act to appropriate $2,100,000 from the unappropriated general fund balance of the end of the fiscal year 2019 to the Department of Education, and Bill 228-35 LS, introduced by myself, co-sponsored by Vice Speaker Talina Cruz Nelson, Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes, Senator Amanda Shelton, and Senator Clint Rigel. An act to appropriate $2,900,000 from the unappropriated general fund balance as of the end of fiscal year 2019 to the Department of Education for the construction of Simon Sanchez High School. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my colleagues. Starting from my far left, I have Senator Mary Torres. I have Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes, Speaker Jose Pito Terlay, Senator Will Castro. I have to my far right, I have Senator Therese Terlay, Senator Tello Taitigui, and Senator Kelly Marsh Taitino. Got a full house. Almost enough for quorum. General rules for public hearing. The conduct of this public hearing shall be as follows. Those testifying will be recognized in the order of sign up on the sign-in sheet. Written testimony may be read. Lengthy written testimony should be summarized to about 5 minutes, but if more time is needed, it will be be allowed. Written testimony shall be submitted to the committee. Please provide our legislative staff with your written testimony for photocopying. Testimony shall be confined to the substance, so if we're discussing a specific bill, stick to the subject. Individuals will be allowed to present oral testimony only once. Once you're done, you may be asked to remain in the room for a question or for additional testimony as may be desired by the members of the panel. Proper form and decorum shall be practiced by all present in the public hearing room for these proceedings. Individuals who fail to maintain proper form and decorum may be restricted from providing oral testimony or may be asked to leave or be escorted and removed from the room. When you speak, please make sure that the microphone is on and that you speak into the microphone. Please state your name for the record. We will now begin to hear testimony on Bill 246-35. And I ask Mr. Ken Leon Guerrero to please come forward, Ms. Maria Pangilinan, and Mr. Dave Duenas. Dave, come on up, Dave. You signed in. Bill 246-35. After every election cycle, the Guam Election Commission is mandated to produce an election analysis report. This report is to provide the public with information on the last election and provide insight on the way the election was conducted along with the results from that election and previous elections. The report also proffers various recommendations for changes in Guam election laws. It was through this report that Bill 246 was drafted, taking into consideration the various recommendations provided by the Guam Election Commission, along with the addition of other proposals to strengthen election laws. Over several months, my team met with Guam Election Commission staff to iron out the various parts of the bill toward making it a stronger bill. An example, we will move to remove Section 2 of the bill relative to campaign signs, as it already exists in Guam laws, an oversight during our bill research and refining. We included a provision to create the Guam Election Commission revolving fund. This fund will be created separate and apart from the general fund and will have reporting requirements that the Guam Election Commission director must adhere to. Additionally, we are creating a campaign finance report review division. With the ability to hire up to 3 personnel, the division will be responsible for reviewing and reporting to the commission all individuals who do and do not comply with all finance reporting requirements. We are also proposing a provision to cover one office eligibility and an unsuccessful candidacy. It's intended in the legislation that candidates who are unsuccessful in the primary may not run in the general election as a candidate in the same position under the same party. These candidates will be able to run as a write-in under a 3rd column separate from their party column. While there is still much work to do, I realize that this bill may see other changes that will enhance the provisions that the bill will affect in the preparation and execution of the Guam election. Today, we must also hear from others who wish to proffer other suggestions and making our election law stronger and clearer. I look forward to hearing the testimony offered today, and thank you for sharing your thoughts on the bill. We will begin with, as the sign-in started, with Mr. Ken Leon Guerrero, followed by Ms. Pangilinan, and then Dave Duenas. Mr. Leon Guerrero.
My name is Ken Leon Guerrero. I'm testifying on behalf of Guam Citizens for Public Accountability. To begin with, this bill misses its primary goal, which is reforming the election process. If this bill was truly to reform the election process, the first item in this bill would be the political parties will reimburse taxpayers for the cost of the primary election. Since the primary election is designed solely to determine who will represent the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. There's no reason why taxpayers should pay the burden of this cost. If we are going to have a primary election and it's going to be paid for by taxpayers, taxpayers are not out of their area of responsibility to ask the government to have the political parties reimburse the taxpayers for the cost of this election. The second thing is, as I went through this bill and I went through the election law, there are a lot of problems in Guam election law, and most of them have not been addressed by this bill. For example, in section, in 3 GCA 1, section 11, under general elections, recognized political parties are a group or organization that has, which shall have polled in the last general election in the event which it had a candidate for each office to be filled, not less than 10% of votes cast therein. And then you go to another section that says, basically, no party can enter candidates into a general election until they have put candidates into 2 successive elections. So how can a new party organize if it's not allowed to be recognized unless it's had a candidate that's gotten 10% of votes, when in another section it says you can't enter into an election until you've had candidates in 2 elections that have got more than 10% of the vote? The entire election law has all kinds of contradictions like these. I filed some legal actions against the Guam Election Commission over the last election because there are conflicting legal laws about how to read votes, how to count votes. None of those are addressed in this legislation here. The fact that this legislation doesn't do anything to make it easier for new people to run for office is a problem, because it treats independent candidates as if they are a different breed. In order for me as a Democrat to be certified in a primary election, I have to get place in the top 15 and have a minimum of 4% of the votes cast in the primary election for the party. But if I run as a candidate, I have to have 10% of total votes cast. You see, these are the types of things that are throughout Guam election law that need to be identified, streamlined, and repaired before we go on to loftier things. I mean, one of the things that is so apparent right now is the fact that there's nothing in this bill that says if an elected official is vacant from his position for 30 days or more, that position shall be declared vacant. But we have a section here targeting how we're going to replace Mike Sinicolas. So you see, this bill is very partisan. It's partisan towards strengthening control by political parties over the election process, and it does not do anything to streamline the election process. We're allowing the supporters to move to 50 feet. It was bad enough at 100 feet, and I say that as a person who went to numerous polling stations to try to do exit surveys. But even at different places around the island, we had the supporters coming so close, and they would crowd around the entrances of the gates and harass people that are walking through the gates to go vote. And now you want to bring them up to the entrance of the building, which basically 50 feet is. You're going to have them on the curb of all the high schools at 50 feet. So I disagree with that. The whole thing about the write-in candidate, that appears to be targeting people. I know you guys refer to it as the loser law, but if you think back to the last write-in campaign was driven by citizens. Frank Uggan didn't even acknowledge the write-in campaign till 31 days after Andre Bainham and I started it. So I understand why you're putting that if we started another write-in campaign, Frank can't claim to be a Democrat. And from our perspective, it doesn't really matter because after we started the write-in campaign, he never held himself as a Democrat. So, but that's what I'm talking about. This bill right here should die in committee, and it should be reworked. Maria and her people know what a lot of these flaws are. I'm sure that they've had some input into it, but you need to get more input from members of the community that are heavily involved in the political process before you try recrafting this bill so that we could address all the idiosyncrasies that are targeted against the people. And when we do that, then we will have an election law and an election process that will be easier for everyone to understand. It will be political party candidates and independent party candidates will be on equal footing, and it'll make Maria's job a lot easier when she doesn't have to deal with me as much as she had to in the last election. No offense. So just in summary, this bill doesn't address the real needs. It doesn't address the flaws that we see in the system today, specifically with the situation with the Mayor of Jonia. It doesn't do anything to either eliminate the primary election and let the parties hold it themselves or require the political parties to reimburse taxpayers for the cost of the election. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pangilinan?
Half a day. My name is Maria Pangilinan, Executive Director of the Guam Election Commission. Biba Año Nuevo Zansizuas Maasi for the opportunity to appear before you on Bill 246-35 to update the Election Code of Guam. The Guam Election Commission is mandated by 3 GCA Section 2103 to submit by June 30th, 2019, we quote, recommendations of the Commission as to amendments or supplementation of laws affecting elections or the office of the Commission. Some of the sections of Bill 246-35 are from the GEC recommendations that are attached to this testimony. The GEC recommendations were submitted June 2019, and follow-up meetings were held with our oversight chair, Mr. Chairman. As a result of subsequent meetings with Mr. Chairman and his staff, and a section-by-section review of Bill 246-35 by the GEC Board in a public meeting on December 2019, we respectfully submit the following additional amendments to Bill 246-35. On Section 5, page 3, line 22. It's a simple addition of a comma after the word felony. If we can possibly use language from Section 6110, and it reads, shall not have been convicted of a felony, comma, and shall not have been convicted of a misdemeanor involving criminal sexual conduct or crime of moral turpitude. The comma would make a big difference. Section 9, page 5. We propose the following changes for the authority of the Guam Election Commission's budget requests. 3 GCA Section 2101 shall be amended to read, there is within as an autonomous instrumentality and an independent commission of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, Government of Guam, known as the Election Commission. Further, 3 GCA 2110 shall be amended to read, detailed budget requests. GEC's annual budget submission for election years shall include a detailed breakdown of the funding level necessary to meet all of its statutory requirements and abide by all policies and procedures set forth in its rules and regulations. Section 1303, Article 3, Chapter 1, Title 5, Guam Code Annotated, shall not apply to the appropriations and allocations to the Guam Election Commission as provided for by the Legislatura en Guahan each fiscal year. GEC may draw against their respective appropriations as needed to meet their obligations in accordance with an annual budget approved by the Commissioners of the Guam Election Commission. Section 10, page 7. 3 GCA, Section 2111, D, letter D. On the Guam Election Commission Revolving Fund. The GEC simply recommends removal of sections 1 to 5 of Section D, Section 2111. Section 11, page 8. Campaign Finance Report Review Division, established. The GEC recommends removal of this section as the GEC is really small and we can do it with one level of hierarchy. Section 17, page 11, line 21. Filing of candidacy fees. The GEC recommends the following. Fees for candidates filing of candidacy. For the governor and lieutenant governor, $5,000. For the senator, $5,000. Delegate, $5,000. Mayor, $1,000. Vice mayor, $500. Attorney general, $1,000. Public auditor, $1,000. Consolidated Commission on Utilities, $1,000. Guam Education Board, $1,000. Section 19 of the bill, page 12, electioneering at polling place prohibited. The GEC recommends that electioneering not be allowed within the fence of any polling place and outside of the school premises. We are, of course, available to answer additional questions and provide additional information. Si Diyos Masi.
Thank you, Ms. Pangilinan. Mr. Duenas. Dave?
Thank you, Senator. Good morning. My name is Dave Duenas, and I'm here to testify on, what's this bill again? 246? 246.
That's correct, Dave.
Okay, thank you. Purposely came here this morning to testify on the filing fees. As we just heard from the Election Commission, their proposed recommendation is $5,000 for the senators and a little higher, for governor and lower for some other offices. It's been my belief that the 100 filing fee that has been in existence for the last few decades is a fair and equal amount. I did a little research. Most of the jurisdictions in the states either have no filing fees for senator and other offices as well. And you can check that for yourself. The filing fees of 100 that hasn't been raised for decades, I don't see. Number one, the filing fees were not initiated as a funding source for the operation of the Election Commission. It is strictly a filing fee. Out of all the states that I've researched, some of them file have a filing fee of none, from $2 all the way up to $7,500 in one particular state. Once again, the $100 filing fee I think is a fair amount. It should be none, but you know, we'll give you the 100. It's been in existence for decades. As testimony on the, as Ken had alluded to, and the Election Commission as well, you're proposing to allow supporters 50 feet from the polling sites or area. I think the 100 feet is reasonable. I can live with that. 50 feet, definitely not. And once again, I want to reiterate that the proposed recommendations, 500 under the bill to raise for the filing fee, particularly for senators, that's a 500% increase. 500% increase. If you go up to the recommendation of the Election Commission of 5,000, that's a 5,000% increase. Totally not correct, not right. With that said, I thank you for hearing my testimony, and I hope you consider what we all have to say, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. I'll ask my colleagues now if they have any questions. Senator Mary Torres, we'll start from the far left.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a lot of concerns with nearly every aspect of this bill, but since we are here to ask questions of the panel, Mrs. Pangilinan, I just want you to explain a little bit about your arrival at the numbers that you propose for the filing fees. I mean, how is it that this bill proposes from 100 to 500 and then you now recommend a tenfold increase? What is that number based on?
Senator, to answer your question, it is only a recommendation. Yes, we looked at the filing fees across the states. We also looked at how the elections are run across the states. And we see, and again, I must reiterate that this is just a recommendation, and this was arrived at a meeting of the Guam Election Commission Board.
So it's a recommendation that would, I mean, because it's a number. So my question is, well, why that number and not another number? Why not a lower number or a higher number? Is it because you're trying to arrive at a budget amount and you're looking at capturing additional funds to the GEC through the filing fees? I mean, what would make that the number that you recommend? Because it's astronomical. It's nearly 10% of the salary of the office, which is just, in my estimate, absurd.
Yes, ma'am. In the discussions that ensued, I was asked about, the board asked about the different, of course, update them on the different processes and how, even to the point of how long it takes to vet the nominating petitions. So in answer to your question, the result was, I mean, they were looking at trying to figure out a funding source for the Guam Election Commission.
Okay. Because what I think this accomplishes, among other things in the bill, is it doesn't encourage participation, and it doesn't encourage a good representation of all brackets, economic brackets within the community. And one of the things that we have talked about in the past was the need to get people more involved, not only in the election process by registering to vote, taking barriers, minimizing barriers that discourage people from voting. And I think that in the past 4 years, some of the legislation that was introduced in my first term, we're now seeing the fruition of that, where voter registration is higher, voter participation at the polls is not necessarily higher, but But I think that when you have these sorts of measures in place, it really begs the question of who is it that you're trying to encourage or discourage? And is it now going to be a participation of only the rich and the affluent? Or is it true representation of our community, which includes people who perhaps do not have the means to buy an election, but have the brains to sit in an office and contribute responsibly? So, you know, those are the things that concern me when we start talking about money and what allows for accessibility to the process. And I know right now that given the cost of campaigning and the frequency of elections every 2 years, we're not opening the doors. We're really putting up a brick wall in this process, and that's what I find so gravely concerning about that recommendation out of the GEC, and this among other aspects of this bill. But no, thank you. So in essence, it was just a number to arrive at a pot of money. And the true intent of getting people involved was secondary to that consideration, I'm gathering from your answer.
May I? Ma'am, Senator Torres, I guess we understand the severity, maybe, is a good word, of the increase in the filing fees. And again, it's a recommendation. And again, the resources that are required for Guam Election Commission to operate and to conduct fair and honest election is somewhat few and far between. And so thank you for your comments. We know we want to increase the voter participation as we have already been increasing the number of registered voters.
Anything further, Senators? That's it? Thank you. I know the speaker asked to be passed. Senator Chirlai, Pidu, do you have anything, sir?
That's restrict the opportunity for the different type of people, especially when their finances are very low. And I, for one, would say that maybe if I am guaranteed to win the election, maybe I'll go ahead and fork in the $5,000. But I think when you look at the recommendation, it's saying that you want to meet your finances for the election commission during the process. But the thing is, whenever you have a shortfall in your finances at the end, you know, the senators will come out, you ask for additional funding. So we do that. We did that last cycle. So I would not probably be involved in running for senator again, knowing that but the thing is the opportunity to allow the different type of people, especially with those that have the brains and they don't have the funding to support the $5,000. And I was thinking, what is the rationale for that much of an increase from what, $100 to $5,000? That's really unimaginable for me. So I just want to thank the Election Commission for making that recommendation, but please lower it, please, just a little bit. All right? Thank you.
Senator Castro.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to meet with me in person regarding some very strong reservations I have for the bill. I couldn't underscore more fully what my colleague, Senator Torres, had mentioned. But if I could just pick up on the line of questioning, either from you, Mr. Chairman, or any member of the panel, what the rationale was, not from the amount, but maybe the strong restrictions on the moniker, on the use of a name, on the restriction of a name, on confining it to your legal name as reflected in any state-validated identification. whether the co-sponsor or members of the panel can just provide some background information.
Senator, would you, you want us to clarify on why the requirement for the legal name?
So in my prior discussion with the principal author of the bill, as it reflects right here, right now, it's my understanding that the intent is to restrict the moniker or how you would reflect you want to be recognized by the people of Guam to your legal name. For example, if my name is William Mendiola Castro, but I prefer to list my name as Will Castro or Tsedu or whatever the cultural or lineage background may be that best identifies me, as long as it's recognizable and attested to by persons of authority, that seems to be the general rule of thumb. I'm just asking what the intent is to restrict, as I understand it from the prime author. Why would we restrict it to your legal name? For example, I know people, Vicente Anthony Camacho as an example, better known as Tony. What is the rationale behind restricting the listing of the name to your legal published name?
That's the law. So we did not address any changes to that, knowing that the legislature at the time passed that law that the legal name be used.
Okay, so then I'm hearing that I'm pretty clear on the law because I listed my name, but based on that testimony, and I halab na edzu no intensyon mo, itestigo mo, and the time comes on the floor, I'm going to hold it to that because the promulgation of the law, as I was understanding it to be when the bill was being drafted, is to restrict it to that, because I'm fully aware that I may put my name, otherwise known as Will Castro, on the side, but I understand the strict interpretation of that may or may not be permissible, but that's okay. Also, I agree with Senator Pito Tulahi, and again, I don't mean to use this as a platform, Mr. Chairman, for the political rhetoric, but I think it's outrageous that you would ask a member of the public to fork out $5,000 to run for an office. I think that is the most undemocratic posture that we can take as a legislative body. But I do want to thank you for hearing my concerns then and for assuring me on the side, but I want to say it for the record that we will revisit this both as a committee but also as a body. I have no problems if the party should choose to increase the barrier to entry for the average qualified citizen to run. That's fine, because that, in my opinion, could be the prerogative of any type of a party. But for someone to come off the street and file, maybe $100 is acceptable. But when you look at the median income of the average person on Guam as compared to the states, I couldn't find one state in the roster that exceeds $1,000. Maybe there's one $1,250, so $2,000. But $5,000? And I can make light of it by stating for the record what's true. If you look at how much I take home on a net basis, Mr. Chairman, this definitely doesn't make it reasonable, doesn't make it tenable, and it's certainly not practical for the average American to be able to seek any elected office in the land. And if that's the intention, then I stand by my position that's the most undemocratic posture, and I appeal. I appeal to my colleagues because I know that's not your intention of yourself as a prime author or my colleagues. So I will plead with you. I will plead with you, Mr. Chairman, to please revisit that provision, both the recommendation, because I know that the Republican Party of Guam has representatives on the commission, so I'd like to follow up on the minutes and the dialogue of how it came to be that we would recommend such an outrageous position in order for the people to qualify for elected office. So please, if I could, let's revisit that, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, maybe even make it 0, it was testified. We'll now move to Senator Therese Terlai.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The bill is quite, it does so many different things. So it's a very difficult bill to discuss and to follow. I mean, we would take forever, I think, if we were going to go through even just each section and ask why and ask, what would be the result of these things. I do also share the concerns of my colleagues regarding the fees. I think we should abolish the fees. It's really, if we want, what I would like to see is more candidates, not less. And so I guess we're looking to you at the Guam Election Commission to tell us what is the issue that you're trying to solve by raising the fees? I'm hoping it's not to limit the number of candidates. But if you could just articulate for us why you need these fees to be increased.
Again, Senator, we want more candidates because that's what makes good elections, more candidates and the participation of our voters. Again, like I told Senator Torres, our problem at the Guam Election Commission is that resources are getting fewer and far in between elections too.
All right. The original increase in fees was actually not recommended by the Guam Election Commission in your original letter. So I noticed this too. So you sent a letter at one point. You request changes to the law. And those changes, a lot of them are, name what kind of ID we're going to use. I think the most significant one in your original letter was really closing the registration dates a lot earlier than what we do right now, which I wanted to ask you about that. But because we're on the fees right now, that was actually proposed by the authors of the bill to increase these fees significantly up from $100 to $1,000. But now Guam Election's coming back in their second letter and saying, let's go even higher to $5,000. So, I don't know, Mr. Chair, I'm hoping we can separate a lot of the items in this bill because, those deserve a lot more discussion. If it's funding source for GEC, I would like to discuss that by itself because we're talking about changing, who can register to vote. That's very significant by itself in this bill. Who can run as a candidate? I think the last thing I want to do is limit that. I want to expand that in every way possible. Is it really necessary to close the registration dates as early as you have proposed? I think you're changing it by 30 days, is what you're proposing to.
Thank you for asking, Senator Tlahi. Right now, with online voter registration and motor voter registration ongoing, since we put the motor voter registration on last week in March of 2019, where we would traditionally get 10 new voters registered inside a month, now we're getting on average 250 registered voters per month on average since motor voter registration. And we also have online voter registration going on. And because of all these opportunities to vote, to register, and the convenience where volunteer registrars can go to the homes, our objective for closing registration 21 days actually before the election. What happens is we want volunteer registration to close 45 days before the election, okay? And the reason being that the challenge we always have is volunteer registrars at this point need to come in and turn in their registration forms or account for the controlled registration forms. So we know that if Therese Terlahi registered with you to vote, you turn in almost immediately that registration form. We get in trouble when the registrars, the volunteer registrars, don't come in. Then our voter registry, our signature roster, because at this point, we only have 10 days to clean up the rosters and prepare it for election. 100% accuracy is what we're striving at. No matter what the last day is, I think on the last day of registration, in the past, we've gotten anywhere from 800 to over 1,000 new registrants to input entirely and make sure it's correct inside of 10 days, not 10 working days, 10 days right before the election.
What is the, thank you for that answer. What is the other sections of this bill that were not recommended by the Guam Election Commission and that you've made no comment on? I'd like to ask you if there is, for example, the write-in limitation that's added by this bill. Does the Guam Election Commission have any comment on that part?
Ma'am, at this time, it's good to say that in this case, because in the past we say we're ministerial in nature, and what the legislature will pass, we will implement. So in our discussions at the public meeting of the board, there were no comments were made on that that section.
And the special election to fill the delegate's seat?
Again, no comments were made on that section.
All right, and the, all right, Mr. Chair, I'd ask if we could get another round if it's possible.
Yes.
Thank you.
As a matter of fact, Ms. Penglin, before I move to Senator Tello and Senator Kelly, could you comment about the section that Senator Reese is actually talking about, the delegate? It's not about the current delegate, it's the provisional law. Maybe that's what you need to state, because I don't think my colleagues understand that exactly what Mr. Ken brought up is that it's about getting Congressman Snickers out of office. No, it's not. It's about what the law exists, and please explain that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That law, that bill, that section of the bill puts into, if it's passed, puts into law a way to get, a way to deal with the vacancy for the non-voting delegate for Guam. Across the nation, there are provisions in state law how to deal with the vacancy in Congress for both the senator and the congressman, depending on each state. So Guam law is absent of how to, at this point, Guam law is absent on how to replace a congressman when the position becomes vacant. Nothing else.
Mr. Chair, could I ask one more
Okay,
question?
yes, Senator Lai.
Just, and then about the holiday. Can you tell us is there any statistics or something that shows us what is the impact of declaring a holiday on election day?
We believe, and we didn't do a thorough study, but we believe in the past, when it's a holiday, we have higher voter turnout. And as opposed to it not being a holiday. Operationally, what happens for the Guam Election Commission, in a lot of cases, we cannot get the precinct officials back to us if it's not a holiday.
Senator Tello.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, well, I'm sure when you said $5,000, the song came in my head, "Oh, Maria, Maria," what are you thinking, you know? So I was like, okay, so I'm sure you got the consensus of this panel, and I think it's obvious, you know, Maria, that if you're having issues on funding, that we have to go that route. But, you know, I was hoping that we would come with something that helps the Election Commission by lowering some of the costs that you incur. I know it's very difficult, what you have right now, the staff that you have. And that brings me to a question with regards to, can you work with what you've done by the proposed campaign finance report review division? Can it be done with the current staff that you have?
In our conversation with Mr. Chair, with a couple of our board members present, we know that we need additional staff if we're going to do a better job at campaign finance. if you look across the nation, even Saipan, their election commission doesn't deal with campaign finance. So we at the election commission at this point, I think in our discussion with Mr. Chairman, we've worked it and we're learning it, and we have learned it, and we wanted to make changes on the campaign finance law, but we took back and we talked to Mr. Chair and said, at this point, there are already over 20 candidates that have filed organizational reports for 2020. To make changes on the campaign finance laws now will be very complicated, because then we would have to go back to the over 20 candidates and let them know that these changes have been made. With regard to, do we have enough staff to do it? In our conversation with Mr. Chairman, we said we would probably need 3 additional staff. 2 will be full-time, strictly, in most cases, all the time. We can use 2 dedicated staff on campaign finance, if that's the will of the people, that campaign finance be strictly regulated.
So what you're saying is currently, right now, you can do it with 2 staff on board, or you?
With 2 additional staff. We have.
So you need 2 additional.
Yes.
To
We
do
have.
this, but you can't, I mean, technically you're doing it right now, because many of us who've already filed, myself included, and even based on last year's election, or 2 years ago now, election, we were brought in to review our financials, and we did that individually with you, and then you also held a meeting, I think 2 meetings, to go over these financial reviews. So technically you're doing it right now, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. But if you notice the time lapse, we are now fully reviewing 2018 election cycle campaign finance. And so with the current FTEs, or full-time equivalent number of personnel with us, we cannot review preliminary reports of campaign finance when they are submitted. We have to wait until after certification of elections.
I see, it does, there's a huge delay, I understand that, and that's, the recommendations that you made on your testimony. Actually, I wanted to try and find you and discuss this bill before we came here, to understand more, and I know that the first thing is, Ken mentioned something earlier, and he talks quite a bit to the Guam Election Commission about opportunities and scenarios that would actually make a better election and more solid and easier to follow. And one of them, I think, was the possibility of having no primaries. And if I'm not mistaken, Ken, I think, having the parties, the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, to choose their candidates to run, to bypass the primary and go straight into a general election with their candidates, that they have their own elections in their own parties to put into fruition. So my question is to you, have you visited that possibility? Has the board been able to visit that type of possibility?
As you know, the board is made up of 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So I'm sure there's conversation outside the boardroom about primary elections. Has the board, has the Guam Election Commission discussed that in the past? Again, I want to say that unless we're asked with that particular issue, I believe that we must say we're ministerial in nature, and we will implement or enforce the laws that are passed by the legislature. So, Senator, I want to say that whether the Guam Election Commission handles the primary or not, we want to see what the will of the people and what the legislature passes.
Okay, so it sounds like something that could be done through legislation. I know there's so many questions I have in all these amendments that you've made or recommendations you made, but the one thing I wanted to ask especially was the first recommendation, and that is to become there is within, as in an autonomous instrumentality, an independent commission of the executive, legislative, judicial branch government of Guam, known as the Election Commission. So can you just explain why is it important for the Election Commission to have this amendment? What was this discussion about it? And can you just elaborate why it's important for you guys?
Okay. The governor is elected. The 15 senators are elected. There is already in existence in the current law that a detailed budget of the Guam Election Commission is to be submitted to the legislature directly. And that's what our practice has been. Unfortunately, in the process of pushing our documents through, especially in the heat of the election process, there are different interpretations as to what independent and autonomous are. And the complication is, Senator, is because most autonomous agencies are generate their own funds.
Yeah.
Whereas the Guam Election Commission, by law, the funds for the elections must be from the general appropriations. So in fact, it's kind of an oxymoron that we're taking money from the general appropriation. Who are we held accountable by? And it's the public and the voters. And so what the current law does is it's not very clear as to how or who the final approving authority is for Guam Election Commission. We maintain that in order to maintain independence, the Guam Election Commission is the final approving authority.
So the board would be the one deciding on how the money is spent.
Actually,
As an autonomous agency, boards are the ones who decide on how the money is spent, where it's spent, what it's used for, things like that. So right now, currently by law, the funding that we give you is already dictated by the director yourself, right? Or does the spending have to be approved by the board?
actually, before I bring the budget to the legislature, we get, the board approves it. So our process is, we follow the BBMR process of the budget call. But we do not submit it to BBMR, it's submitted to the legislature. For ease of operation, we use their forms, but we go through the same process, and it first goes to the board, gets approved, and by January 31st, it's submitted to the Office of Finance and Budget here at the legislature.
And, it was earlier said by my colleague that, there's so much in this bill right now. It goes from, A to Z, and it should really, some of this stuff should be separate and apart and a separate bill so it doesn't get lost. There are some good things in here, but, I see that it should be separated to allow that conversation, simplify it, even for the audience to understand, because this just it affects everybody on this island who wants to run or are thinking of running. It's important that we give that piece, especially this section, a separate bill by itself. The other one is I asked the good chairman, for a fiscal note, and this is the reason why, because of the holiday. We need something from BBMR to tell us the impact of what would happen if we turn this into a holiday, how much it'll cost the government of Guam. So, Mr. Chair, maybe if you can ask BBMR so we can find that what that amount is. The last question I have, Maria, is with regards to my colleague asking regarding the name, having the name done like on the real ID card, et cetera, like that. Is the Election Commission still allowing that parentheses or quotation, familia, pampuru, underneath the name of the individual? Or so in the past you have allowed it, and even in this last election. So with the request of this amendment in the law, is it still applicable to allow that little quotation or parentheses, familian pampuru or Tony, and instead of VA added, it would be Tony? I mean, sorry, he's a good friend of mine, so I could use it, but.
Again, both of what you're referring to, the legal name issue and the better known as, both are still in the law.
Okay.
The clarification we want to make is that the forms, the nominating petitions that sometimes in the past our candidates have gotten in trouble where they started passing out nominating petitions or circulating nominating petitions, and their legal name does not appear anywhere on the form.
I see.
So we cannot take those. So, and that's all we're trying to do is
Okay.
clarify that portion of the law.
Oh, it's very simple then. Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification. And Kelly, is there anything any comment that you want to make with regards to, the Election Commission and a different process? Or I know I saw you kind of move there, nudge, ready to say something, and.
Yes. The first thing that I wanted to say is that I think this bill is too important of a bill to pass it now with just a short time before the election and people already in the process of executing. I think this is a bill that needs a lot more work. I think there needs to be a round table on it, and bring in active people. One of the other things I forgot to mention that wasn't in this bill was recomposition of the Guam Election Board or commissioners, because during the last election I tried to get onto the board, but I was barred by law. And we need to, right now the Election Commission is controlled by political parties. We need to have equal representation. So if there's 6 members of political parties, there should be 6 independent people on it. And most importantly, as we are seeing right now play out with the situation in Jonia, there needs to be included in this law and in 5GCA a provision that anytime a elected or appointed or exempt official is absent from their position 30 days or more, it needs to be filled. And in the case of an in the case of an elected official, there needs to be a special election called for 30 days after the position has been declared vacant. In the case of an appointed official, then another candidate gets appointed. In the case of an exempt employee, so on. But we can't let these situations drag out, because as we saw, not just with Jonia Mayor, but in Department of Corrections, we had a number of officers and other people get wrapped around the axle on this as well. I'm worried that as this meth epidemic continues to expand, we're seeing law enforcement officers being wrapped up in this as well. And so the situation will get worse before it gets better. Therefore, we need to have a mechanism in place to make sure that the wheels of government are turning smoothly and evenly on that. So going back, this bill needs to be a 2021 bill to get beyond this election. It needs to be a round table bill to get opinions from many active political players, not just the political parties. And we also need to get this mechanism in for dealing with vacancies. I know that Maria's staff has a lot of work that they do. I don't believe that they need to be autonomous as much as they need to get proper funding, which seems to be the direction she's heading there. And with the proper funding, I think it only goes to strengthen the election process, because I know that coming into this year, she was like almost $200,000 in arrears just because of the increased cost. And now by making an election a holiday, we've raised the cost of our elections from $1 million to $3 million. So that's something else that we need to consider. The BBMR did an analysis, and a government-paid holiday costs taxpayers $1 million. So if we're going to make the election a holiday, it's going to be $1 million right there. And now we're looking at between $400,000 and $500,000 for the primary and $400,000 and $500,000 for the general. We're at $2 million, and then we have to look at the associated costs from Department of Education and the Guam Police Department. And we know from Maria's, I mean, they gave her a $200,000 bill for security, right? Was that it? From the GPD and DOE for use of facilities? Not that much, anyway. But the whole point is there are associated costs that go along with it. I believe Maria needs the money she needs to run an election. A well-run election will encourage more people to run, and more importantly, more people to vote. I agree with her about closing the registration early, because I have seen what her office goes through dealing with the deluge of last-minute registrations. But we now have so many more opportunities to register than we had before that I agree with her on that point. She just needs time to get them into the books properly, because one of the biggest things we saw was how many provisional ballots, because people were coming in saying, I registered, but they hadn't gotten the thing in. And there were a lot there, almost 1,000 as I recall. Some, no, between, all right, over 100. I'm thinking of the spoiled ballots.
Okay, do you have any other
I
questions?
got confused with spoiled.
Okay, why don't we
Okay.
proceed with the other senators, and then I'm going to open the door for you folks to...
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, Maria, I think we should separate some of these requests here to separate bills, and so we can get them through right away, and then the round table. I truly believe in that. Thank you again, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator Tello. Senator Kelly?
Hafaday, Mananasi'tu'us. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's always important to hear from as many portions of our community as possible, and to hear a wide diversity of ways of evaluating and assessing. So many of the things that I picked up on have been discussed, and I will just maybe mention a few of them briefly. I do think it's important to look for and address inconsistencies while this is going back to the committee and the committee is working on this bill. We need to be addressing those as much as possible throughout all the work that we do. I do want to mention with the nicknames, part of my background is being an anthropologist, and so I just want to throw some anthropological information out there. And I too noticed that it wasn't something that was specifically mentioned in the testimony, although it had been addressed here and there otherwise, that there may indeed be a strict interpretation. And so in our earliest ethnography for the Chamorro people and the community of Guahan by Laura Thompson in 1941, she mentioned specifically the Chamorro tradition of the Chamorro tradition of nicknames. And within her ethnography, we can find a compilation of all kinds of nicknames. And so I don't remember her discussion of how far back this dates, but she felt it was an important Chamorro value to be documenting and writing down. And so we can find all kinds of nicknames there, and I've always enjoyed reading through them. It feels like it's a little touch of and continuation of history and that cultural value and that cultural tradition to see us continuing to use those. And so there's that, and then of course, I think one of the senators previously was alluding to some of this. There are the traditions of knowing and identifying each other. And again, this is in several ethnographies for Guam, that one of the first things that we do as a community, and even for me as a non-Chamorro, people will identify myself this way, and the discussion will be with others. And it's called basically like social and cultural mapping to understand where people are in the landscape. And so we do the whole genealogy thing. And so it might not be a legal name, but it's going back to all of the iterations of family names that one has in one's ancestry. So I can see definitely value in continuing both of those opportunities, and maybe it needs to be put in there explicitly, because it seems like maybe it's been interpreted thus far and has allowed for those inferences, those opportunities to share those parts of oneself and one's family, but perhaps language to make that clear. We have all kinds of family in our genealogy, but then we also have our family branches. Familian Azuzu, Familian Banadu, Familian Cueto, et cetera, et cetera. And so I see it as something that continues those traditions and those cultural values, and just something that's important for Guam. So in looking at the signage, I wanted to ask the director, Pangilinan, in the signage for elections, do we address, or does this bill address, we know that we have election campaigning that occurs here for off-island areas, for the presidency of FSM, for senators and presidency of Palau, and so forth. In the way that the bill is written or the law stands, do you see any improvements, or do you feel that it adequately covers that kind of potential signage for these off-island elections that do take place in our community?
Senator, so like with the FSM elections, do the signage laws cover them as well? Well, the signage laws are actually those are enforced by the Department of Public Works. With regard to our specific recommendation, we had to take it back because actually the signage law was changed, and when it was changed, political signage is not allowed on public property. So does it take into consideration the FSM election per se? Yes, because they could always be put on private property, as far as we can see. And again, I say that I just to answer your question, but that is better answered by the Department of Public Works.
Sujuis Masi. And what I'll do is I will go back to those sections myself and follow up with them if need be, just to make sure that we're addressing the full landscape of what does occur here on island. Now, one of the things, we've had some discussion about whether this the general election could operate better or serve its functions better as a holiday. And certainly, I noticed the difference between when the primary election landed on a Saturday versus the general election, which was on a work day, and then there were all sorts of issues and inconveniences that ensued. So one of the possibilities, and as far as I've looked it up, at least thus far, it doesn't seem to be inorganic to propose having it on a Saturday. The Saturday seemed to work really well. A lot of people were out. A lot of people were able to turn up for voting. So I don't know the full situation of that. I guess it would probably take some legal review. But perhaps I could ask from this last situation, as a person on the side, it seemed that Saturday was very different from Tuesday. Do you have any recollection of the difference between our primary election, which happened on a Saturday, versus on a Tuesday this last time?
Senator, I must say, I think I'm older than you, but from my recollection, the day of the general election is in the Organic Act. So that's a little bit harder to change. Yeah, that's a little bit harder to change.
Okay, so I'll look again to see if to look for that in the Organic Act. And it can always be addressed by perhaps resolution for us to encourage some change in that, to provide some flexibility if that is needed. And then there has been a lot of discussion about the filing fee calculations, and of course, for all of us, we want it to be as open to people of all portions of our community as possible. We don't want it to be a barrier of any sort. And again, in that, there are some other models, if any of it was about addressing frivolous filing. We've heard you answer that a lot of it was about making ends meet between the work that needs to be done and the budgetary considerations and so forth. But there are some other models you mentioned that the board has looked at other states, but even other countries have other systems. They have deposit systems, and I'm not saying that does any better in a sense for eliminating, because if it was a $500 deposit, it's still $500. But it can be, there maybe can be some reassurance that if certain seriousness by the candidate are adhered to and performed and demonstrated, that a certain amount or all of it could be refunded. So if that was any of the consideration for frivolous filing, even beyond the states, there are other models to look at. Do you know, did the board look at any other models beyond the United States that you know of?
Again, with the filing fees, it was brought here at the public hearing that we did not initiate the amendment to the filing fee. But when our good chairman initiated the fee, of course, that was a point of discussion with the board. It has been mentioned in the past that if you're asking about international, in Australia, if you don't vote, you're fined. You have to vote, otherwise you'll be fined. In parts of California, in some counties, there are counties that fund part of the campaign, where the county puts up part of the campaign, but there's a restriction and a cap as to how much one can spend. In other areas, and just like Guam, filing fees, police reports, court clearances can all be paid with campaign contributions. So all that could be covered by campaign contributions.
Situus Masi for providing that background information. I earned my PhD in Australia, so I'm very familiar with that. And I had really tried to pay attention and talk to people about what they felt the differences were between having to vote and having the option of not voting. And I think nationally, that's an important thing for us to be continuing to think about. And I think you bring up a very good possibility of something that we could be looking at, because again, if the goal here is to make it more democratic and more open to everybody having a fairly equal chance, is to have those restrictions on how much one can spend. So that might be something to be looked at as well. My last question here is whether you received any legal guidance in how to fill vacancies. So if that was something that the board looked at, and then whether they received any legal guidance in how to fill vacancies?
Are we specifically looking at my village, ma'am?
Oh, Ahi, I was just, I was looking at it in general, and in the one section that I looked at specifically where it mentioned, well, I do want to know overall, so village
Okay.
by village, and then at all the other levels as well. But my question is going towards the direction of pulling a name, but you're right. I do want to address this on a more general level of whether there was legal guidance in understanding how to fill our various vacancies that may be addressed in the bill. It's important to close these gaps. We're finding that there are some gaps or some things that are absent. So it'd be important to hear if you received any legal guidance there or sought any.
So with regard to the actual bill, we worked, both the board and the staff worked closely with our legal counsel in reviewing those. With regard specifically to vacancies, again, it was looked at, and again, the board did not provide any comments. But we did note, the board and the staff and legal counsel did note that the current law, the current election code, is absent of how to fill a vacancy for the office of non-voting delegate to Congress. With regard specific, may I address that to the Jotnia mayor? Yes, we received legal guidance on on how to proceed. And again, the law states that there must be a vacancy, and there are stipulations as to what constitutes a vacancy in the mayoral office. At this time, the commission continues to note that there is no vacancy, there is no legal or official vacancy in the office of mayor in Jotnia.
So it's good to hear that you were working close with legal counsel. Did legal counsel make any statements about pulling a name, whether that is considered organic?
Pulling a name for, in terms of the position on the ballot, is that what we're talking about?
Hungen, or at least in the bill, and so I don't know if your board went into detailed discussion, but within the bill it says that for a congressperson or congressional delegate,
I see.
right, that if there is no clear winner, that names will be put on, it may say a sheet of paper, and then the name's pulled.
Actually, Senator, when we did a very superficial survey across the states, there are some states, or maybe just one state, that does it that way. Only when there's a tie.
And that's interesting to hear. There are a variety of laws, and I don't know how far that one dates back to. There are a variety of laws that are still on the books from the 1800s and so forth that maybe don't match up with certain ways that we think of issues today. But it's interesting to hear that. But again, I will double check this. It's my understanding that in the Organic Act it says that there must be a runoff, but I will double check that, and then I would have the committee also look at that just to make sure that we're matching it with something that is organic, or whether we have more flexibility on that or not.
Senator, now that I know that that's the section that you were looking at, we'll take a look at it again and get back with you.
So again, thank you everybody for being here. It's important to have heard all the different issues and concerns so that they can be addressed by the committee, and they can be looked at by all of us.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Reese, do you have any follow-up questions you wanted to ask before I ask questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One more. So in your original recommendation letter, you recommended repeal and reenacting the entire Chapter 17, which is the election campaign contribution and expenditures. Because of the format it was sent in, it's a repeal and reenact. It doesn't show which exact changes you wanted. It just says what we want the whole new chapter to look like. So I wasn't able to track what you're looking for here. What kind of election contribution and expenditure changes is the Guam Election Commission looking for?
Senator, I don't know if you were, if you heard.
By the way, that was not included in the bill at all.
That's correct.
So that's why I'm asking.
We had asked our chair, Mr. Chair, to pull that back because we're so close to the election already, and people have filed their organizational reports. So just so you know that we had, we submitted it in June, but we took it back when we started our discussions. With regard to campaign finance, Chapter 17, one of the high priority items for the Guam Election Commission is changing the dates of filing campaign finance reports. I've talked, as candidates come in to file their reports, one of the things I've talked about is, how do you feel about filing quarterly as soon or quarterly after you filed your organizational report? That's easier. Initially, it'll be hard to get used to, but after a candidate is used to it, we believe it's going to be much easier for the candidates and for us as well, because if a person gets elected in November of 2020, he or she can rightfully start campaigning already January 2021. If that happens, if the person files January 2021 an organizational report for 2022 senatorial election, if that person files in January, it'll be more than a year and a half before that candidate files again. If mistakes are made, if something's not correct, the GEC has nothing to say because we don't see it. The report is not due until a year and a half later. The quarterly requirement to file reports as soon as one decides to run mimics the Federal Election Commission requirement.
The only change that you were looking for?
No.
Okay.
There's a bunch more, ma'am.
I guess since it's not included in the bill, then we can discuss that later.
Yes,
All right,
and it's not because we're too close to the election,
Okay.
and we don't want those changes. I don't think we can effectively handle those changes at this point in time.
All right, thank you. And then you said that the political sign provision, it's been repealed. You were attempting to amend a law that had already been repealed. But can I just ask the intent of that? It was to add in the words for or against a candidate. And I was wondering, would it be your opinion then that signs that say Happy Holidays from Senator Therese are those political signs?
Again, that's not the call of the Guam Election Commission, but what we were addressing at that time is the old law when political signs were allowed on public property where you can pay your permit
Yes.
fee. Yes, okay. It does not include signage for those going against a candidate or an issue.
Okay, so you're
So
just adding the against,
that's
pretty much.
correct,
Okay.
yes.
But has the Election Commission made a determination as to those other types of signs, whether those are political signs and they need to, say whether, or, address where they're paid for, or that's not required anymore?
Yeah, again, signage on the road or in public property is enforced by Department of Public Works. And so we don't look at that, we don't address it at this time. I can talk to our legal counsel
All
and
right.
see if
Okay,
that's
fine.
something
Thank
for
you,
us.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senators, do you have a follow-up question?
I think we have people waiting, so in the
Yes.
interest of time, I'll yield. Thank you.
All right. Okay, nobody else. And just to remind the audience that Mr. Ken, last term, you were in support of my bill. We're trying to get rid of the primary. Thank you for mentioning that today. That's something to seriously consider. Primary
Okay.
not to be paid by the Gov Guam. That I've looked at, and I would love
Absolutely.
to see that happen.
Yeah, I would love to see that happen. Eliminate the primary, let the parties hold their own primary, just have government of Guam pay for the general election.
Correct.
And let any candidate who qualifies run in the general election. But if they want to carry a party support, they would have to run through the party primary.
That's
That-
correct. Also, I appreciate your testimony, Dave, in reference to maybe no administrative fee, no filing fee. That may be something to consider. And I think
Help me better.
most of everybody, and it'll allow everybody on the island that wants to run.
Yeah.
But I think I need to go back to the commission and ask them, we need to maybe increase the penalty if you have a violation when
Yeah.
you file. Maybe that's the way to teach everybody, do it right the first time or pay the fine and move on. Don't pay. Now, in reference to, you mentioned the commission, they have 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans. Maybe it should have, because there's 6 of them, there should be 6. Simple math, there's 3, then add 3 independents. I can see that. I can't see 6. Because, and you know why I say that, Ken? You mentioned earlier, you're a Democrat, but you're also a Democrat in an independent suit. So nothing new, and it's okay. But everything should be equal across the board. That's what I believe in. 3, work it from there. And there's many things that everybody has mentioned. Also, how to fill the vacancy. I think I made it very clear when we talk about the congressional, only because there's nothing in the law. If there was a vacancy, there's no way to fill it today. It would be a vacancy all the way until election, and that was the only intent of that one. On the sore loser part, I brought this up early last year, that the intent was that if anybody wants to run independent, if you're from a party and you didn't pass the primary, you run as independent. But if we get rid of the primary, that will not be an issue no more. That will eliminate that reason for a sore loser. So that being said, there are many, Mr. Ken, if you can please provide us your written testimony, because the committee will take a look at everybody's testimony, and we will determine how to merge it into the bill, make the changes, issues that are brought up by my colleagues. I'll provide them a copy of the recommended changes. If they're comfortable with it, then we'll move from there, because there are many things. There's been 3 bills introduced in reference to Jonia. I'm in a position where my position with the Jonia incident is I'm not going to support recalling a mayor that was voted by the people of Zonia. People of Zonia, tell us what you want in Zonia. You want him removed? Then so be it. Fill in the petition that the election commission has put out, and we will support you. But if only a small handful is asking to be recalled, I can't support that. There's, what, over 1,000 voters there? I prefer they speak. Speak about your village, and we will back your village, but not go into your village and tell you how to run your village. Ken, you look like you're ready to press. You wanted to say something, Ken? Go for it.
Well, in the Jonia mayor's situation, it's unique. I mean, here we have an individual who's arrested by the federal government, and part of the information that's been released is where he's bragging about how he can get shit done. He's got contacts in the police department, he's got contacts in the marshals, he's got contacts at DOC, and the federal witnesses are off island to protect them, and a lot of the people that I've talked to in Jonia, they want to sign, but they don't want to put their name and address down for fear of retribution. See, this is a unique situation right here, and that's why, I've been urging the speaker to call a special session and to have a vote, because people are protected in the voting booth. When they go in the voting booth to check for the recall, their name is not going to appear on a list of people that said, I want to recall the mayor. And that will give the people more confidence about exercising the recall if they don't have to put their name and address on a piece of paper that's going to be submitted publicly. Because the federal government isn't even releasing the names of their witnesses for fear of retribution. And one of the evidences that was provided to the federal court was police officers going around to the witnesses telling them to cooperate with the mayor or else. So in that situation, I understand why the residents of Jonia, though they favor recall, are hesitant to put their names and addresses down. I think the legislature, as the people's house, needs to recognize the unique situation the people of Jonia are facing, step in and exercise for the benefit of the people.
But Ken, wouldn't it be maybe more to say, instead of 30 days, maybe a 90-day window and you're absent? Because if a mayor happens, or anybody, any elected...
Excused absence.
Well,
unexcused. If you've got a 30-day unexcused absence, now it could be medical. If it's medical, then it's excused. If it's emergency call-up for the reserves or something for a special mission to Saipan and typhoon recovery, that would be an excused absence.
So we'd have to list them all, the different options.
Well, within government of Guam, there is a list of excused absences, and anything outside of that
Okay.
would be unexcused. Being
All right.
arrested and thrown in jail, that would be unexcused, but
All right.
emergency medical leave to the Philippines
Okay.
for kidney transplant for 60 days, that
Right.
would be excused.
Okay, thank you. Senator Tello, you wanted a comment? Yes.
Thank you, because this question has been asked of me many times. I didn't know the answer is, what is the cutoff time in which no special election can happen because it's too close to an election time? I remember certain people who left office, there was no election because it was too close. So what is the cutoff time?
The current law dictates that if there's a vacancy, outside of 240 days. So 240 days is March 8, 2020.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. March 8.
All right, that's too soon. All right. All testimony has been...
But it is also within the power of the legislature to
make the
write an
changes.
exception in this case.
Yes, I got that, Ken. Ms. Pangdina, maybe my colleague, what would it cost to run a special election? For any position, actually, because it should be the same price, right? For every position, there's different costs?
It won't be the same price, because for a mayoral election, it would be only in one village. So the vice speaker had written to me and asked me, and I let them know that I believe it was 40, it was 22,850, thank you, for a recall election. But if we were going to go through the recall route, that would be the cost for one election. And if we go the recall route, we will have actually two elections. We will ask the question, do the Georgia voters want to recall the election? That's one election, that's 22,000 out the door. Then we will begin the process of a special election, and that would be another 22.
Okay, my colleagues are commenting that maybe you don't need a recall ballot, just go straight to the election, 22. But that's something that we'll ask for other comments, because like I mentioned, there are 3 bills that are out there in how to take care of Jonier residents. And I'm waiting for that to be referred to me so we can have a hearing as soon as possible. Because of the time frame, we're looking at March, which, how many days would it take to run an election, special election? For Jonier, for example, if we're just gonna do a special election in Jonier, period. No recall, just vote if you wanna.
60 days, sir.
Before-
According to the current law, it's 60 days. And according to the current law, there must be a vacancy. Unless those two laws are changed or other laws are changed, the GEC's hands are tied with regard to running a special election.
So we would have to make quite a few amendments in the current law too. Okay. That being said, this concludes this public hearing on Bill 246-35. And the committee will continue, and please, Mr. Ken and Dave, submit your written testimony so it can be part of the, other than the transcript. Ken, come on now.
They will be. I apologize to the panel. It's just that I didn't get my email notice till 6:44 last night, and I didn't check my email till 5 o'clock this morning.
Yeah, 'cause
Normally, I have my testimony for you.
I know. The committee will continue to receive testimony the next few days. Please address your written testimony to the Committee on General Government Operations and Appropriation Housing and submit it via email to Senator Joe S. at gmail.com. This is Mossy for your attendance and participating in today's hearing. And for those at home, thank you for watching. This public hearing for Bill 246-35 LS is now adjourned. It is now 10:43. And we will take a 5-minute break, Mr. Fernandez, and then we will begin with the 2 bills for DOE. Thank you. Ready? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, Housing convenes this public hearing. The notice were given on December 20th, December 30th, and January 7th. And the time now is 10:52. We will continue this public hearing with Bill, a lot of bills here, but this specific bill is Bill 233-35 COR, sponsored by, or authored by Vice Speaker Talina Cruz Nelson, co-sponsored by myself, an act to appropriate $2,100,000 from the unappropriated general fund balance as of the end of fiscal year 2019 to the Department of Education. We will also entertain testimony on Bill 228, which was introduced by myself, co-sponsored by Vice Speaker Talina Cruz Nelson, Speaker Tina Barnes, Senator Amanda Shelton, and Senator Clint Rigel. An act to appropriate $2,900,000 from the unappropriated general fund balance as of the end of fiscal year 2019 to the Department of Education for construction of Simon Sanchez High School. I have today present to testify, we have Mr. John Fernandez. I know that the chairman of the board was here and he had to leave. He's in support. We also have Mayor Rudy Montanani. I know he's in support. And we also have Frank Kuberners that's here, the man with the fingers on the money. So, Mr. Fernandez, if you would please begin with your testimony.
Good morning, members of the committee, Senator San Agustin. If I may, I know our chairman was here. He wanted me to communicate his apologies. He had an appointment that he could not miss, so he waited. He did prepare testimony, the written testimony before you. Also, I know our mayor also indicated he might have an important appointment as well, and I wanted to just offer the chair and the committee that opportunity if they wanted to go ahead and hear the mayor's testimony first. I'll present on behalf of the chair and the department and answer questions. So I expect we'll probably be there, a little lengthier time for our testimony. So I'm happy to defer to the mayor.
All right. My mayor from Yigo, Mayor Rudy Montanani.
Good morning, Honorable Senator. Thank you for introducing these two bills. It's very, very important, moving forward with, having a good school for our students up there. I realize that although they have all these battles, trying to go to a school that's not fit for them, they still, shine with their education. And I appreciate this bill. Honorable Senator Joe San Agustin, Honorable Senator Kelly Taitano, Honorable Senator Telo Taitegui, Honorable Senator Therese Terlai, Honorable Senator Sabina Perez, and Honorable Senator Mary Torres. Thank you for being here. It shows that, when something as important as building a new school for the students that have suffered so much, showing that it's very important. And I also appreciate the senators that were here and had to leave. So I want to thank you. I want to move forward to just say that I'm in support of Bill 233-35. It's I was here to actually just support Bill 228, but I think we have to get through Bill 233-35 before we entertain Bill 228. Yes. So I just, for the record, my name is Mayor Rudy Montanani of Yigo, and I'm here to support Bill 233-35 and Bill 228. The kids that in Yigo have suffered enough. God, it's a blessing in disguise, that nobody has gotten hurt with the, the school that they're going to. There's a lot of problems up there, and some are pretty bad, and it has a lot to do with safety first. And that's why I totally support these two bills, because the first one is going to be giving the contractors money to move forward with the architecture and engineering of Simon Sanchez. And Bill 228 is moving forward to the right direction. So I appreciate all of you for hearing me out, and that as the Mayor of Yigo, I support these two bills. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. John, when we discuss 228 and 233, if you can please describe what happened on 228, because I understand 233 is reference to vendor payments. That is very clear. But in reference to 228, it's talking about money to take care of Simon Sanchez, but it also addresses that there were some concerns that supposedly you were promised some funds and they didn't come true. And I would like you to please describe that to my colleagues so they can understand why 228 was brought up, to cover those shortfalls so that you become whole in the construction of Simon Sanchez. Sir?
Correct. All right. So thank you, Senator. And as I mentioned before, Mr. Mendiola, our board chair, was prepared to deliver testimony on behalf of the board, and he had to step away for an appointment that he could not get out of. But he did provide written testimony, which you have before you, and then also I did provide separate written testimony that you also should have before you. And in part, they basically both expressed support for bills. As we mentioned, Bill 233 was the bill addressing the shortfall in TEF and looking at the possibility of using the unappropriated fund balance at the end of FY19 to cover that shortfall. And then Bill 228, which is similarly looks at allocating the unappropriated fund balance at the end of the fiscal year 19 to cover what we are calling a funding gap to support the phase 2 of the Simon Sanchez High School construction project. And phase 2 is the architectural and engineering services. So just a status update on that particular project. The Guam legislature transferred authority for the project to GDOE mid-year in 2018. While that authority was transferred, DOE was not able to move forward until all matters were settled before the courts and the Office of Public Accountability, and that all those issues with regard to Cortex protests on that pending procurement, all those matters were resolved and dismissed around November of 2018. So at that point, DOE was able to move forward. Phase 1 of the project was to conduct the land surveying services. So we issued an RFP for the land survey services. We brought on the surveyors, and they completed their work towards the end of summer 2019. Again, that's the survey work on the site. The maps there were quite in need of updating. We worked with the utility company, with GWA and GPA to work out issues that were on the site, but they were able to deliver their deliverables by the end of the summer. The phase 2 involved moving over to the design side and bringing on the architects and the consultants needed to get us through the design. We had hoped to put that procurement out towards the end of fiscal year 2019, so towards that August and September timeframe, once we got the surveying work done. Unfortunately, we had identified the fact that we weren't able to certify funding availability at that time. As you might recall, it's related to the shortfall in TEF that we saw, where we were trying to understand the $2.1 million gap that we would need to just meet the cost of our day-to-day operations. Plus, we were trying to work with the legislature and the governor's office to secure what we estimate to be the cost for the phase 2. So that estimate, I know we've gone over this in the past, it's just an estimate, but if you if you look at the original law that authorizes Simon Sanchez construction, $5.1 million is set aside and to be pledged for the construction of the school. Based on that analysis of of that $5.1 million over a 30-year term and the current interest rate environment, it's been estimated that the total cost of the project would be between $55 to $65 million once it's all said and done, subject to an actual bid coming in. But that's been the estimate of the costs, and then the A&E work is usually estimated between 5 to 10% of your total project costs. So based on that, on those numbers, we had been targeting between $3 to $6 million to be able to certify to support phase 2. And so at that point, before we engaged in, before we moved forward with phase 2, we did indicate to both branches that we were in need of funding to try to close that funding gap. There had been some prior authorization by the legislature to provide funding to support the project. So in FY18, there was about $1.5 million that was pledged to support the project out of the tax amnesty that was supposed to take place at that time. And there was additional $1.1 million that was to be identified in FY19 to go to Simon Sanchez construction. And if that wasn't able to be expended to be used for operations in FY19, which it ended up being used for land surveying services, and then the balance for operations because of the shortfall that we saw in the overall budget. And then the legislature approved an additional $500,000 in authorization for Simon Sanchez in this current fiscal year. So when we look at the prior authorizations, our discussion with DOA is that the authorization's there, but it hasn't been fully funded to the extent that we can move forward with the project. So right now we're looking at the FY18. You allowed us to carry over the FY18 authority, which is about 1.5. With the $500,000 from FY20, that yields us about $2 million in authorization. And then in October, the Board of Education authorized me to be able to use our FY20 appropriation, which is for our day-to-day operations, to fill whatever remaining gap in order to move forward with the project. So the authorization we've been able to cobble together based on FY18 authorization, FY20 authorization, and also the board's understanding that we would use our appropriations to make us whole. And then we need to work with DOA to get the cash. So when there was discuss of a potential surplus, I know Senator San Agustin, you had asked whether it would be useful to identify a source of funding for the authorization, and we said yes, because even though we have the authorization, the cash to back the authorization is important, and we've had this discussion over the past 2 years. We have authorization, but until there's cash, it doesn't become a real certification. So what we've done is we've asked for the support of the legislature. We've talked to the governor's office. I know there's a debate about surplus, and the appropriate use of the surplus, whether to fund to pay down the cumulative deficit of the government, or whether to support, cover the costs of other critical needs. And at that point, I think the board and I would leave it to our elected officials to make the decision about the appropriate use of those funds. What we were here to do is to say that the need that we've identified, the $2.9 million for Simon Sanchez, is a real need. What's going to happen is that in January 23rd is when bids are due. We put out the solicitation for A&E services. I think that went out on December 13th. The bids are due, the proposals are due January 23rd. And then once we get to January 23rd and we get those offers, we'll be able to proceed through negotiation and hopefully execute a contract in February. So by the time we execute a contract in February, we need certainty as to the funding availability in order to certify that contract and move it forward. Now, I think the dilemma here is that the board has said, look, we can't afford to delay this project any further. We are going to have to look at our current resources, our FY20 budget, and if that's all we have, we're going to have to make the necessary hard decisions with that budget to make sure that Simon Sanchez finally moves forward. The only challenge with that is that after negotiating the agency through the federal tax cuts, we already went through a round of cuts in many different ways, and so further cuts are going to be harder decisions. But the board made a decision to move forward in that effort, just so we don't end up at the end of this year with Simon Sanchez High School still in the same place it was last year. However, we know that those cuts to the department are going to be hard decisions, and we did want to ask for the support both of the legislature and the governor's office that if there is funding available, here's the gap that we've identified. Governor Leon Guerrero pledged in October that she would contribute $1.1 million to support the project, and that money has been identified and transferred over to the department. We had estimated, we had been using the number of $4 million would be a reasonable figure to support the A&E work, so the remainder is $2.9 million. And while we have authorization that we can use, we don't have the cash. So with this bill, and should it pass or should the governor sign it into law, this would definitely provide certainty with regard to Simon Sanchez High School being able to move forward and be funded without having to dip into the day-to-day operations of in our FY20 operating fiscal year. And I think that's it would move what has been a shared priority for everybody forward through a critical phase. What's important to know is that once phase 2 is done, the phase 3 is basically the construction and financing of the project. Phase 3 is already funded. There's money identified and pledged to support the financing and leaseback arrangement already. But in order to get there, we have to ensure phase 2 is fully funded. Otherwise, that's where the main obstacle remains. So with that, the other bill here, I think we identified it. The only thing I would say is that every year we come back to the legislature, especially when there is a shortfall in TEF. And of course, we had the property tax discussion and amendment and other issues that affected the projection for the TEF fund. Well, when we get shorted, what that means for the department is our difficulty in paying our vendors on a timely basis, because they've already provided services based on our expectation that the money was coming in. So what ends up happening when there's a shortfall is that our vendors basically we have to work with them to try to make them whole, but it just takes more time and hopefully more resources become available. Over the past 4 to 5 years, as I think we've mentioned to the legislature before, periodic shortages in the TEF have led to, I think, $15 to $18 million in shortfall over that period of time that we've constantly just tried to manage and move forward. So I think, as we deal with this, should money be available to make us whole, that would be wonderful. But looking forward and trying to avoid the recurrence of this issue, one of the policy changes we would ask is that in the next budget, if it's possible to fully fund DOE out of the general fund. I think we tried this one year, right, Senator, fully out of the general fund and not as reliant on TEF, which has been inconsistent and unreliable in some years. That would at least avoid the recurrence of this issue and allow us to plan better for the funds that will be available to the department. So with that, you have my testimony. I kind of summarized most of the points. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, sir. Senator Torres, do you have any questions on either bill? Okay, they're available for questions on both bills.
I find it very reassuring that this would accomplish phase 2, and that phase 3 is already organized, so that once we get over this hurdle, we are on our way to actually building the school, which is a very good thing, and I don't want to ever be part of denying the children that. What I find very curious, though, is this is about $5 million from the unappropriated funds. And while there is a comment from BBMR about not recommending this appropriation, there's also a fiscal note that shows it's not going to impact the budget necessarily, because those are unappropriated funds that are in place. But the question I have is, are we certain, and Mr. Chairman, maybe you can chime in, are we certain that those unappropriated funds while they would be designated to reduce the government debt, are those appropriated funds intact given what we know about the war claims bill and the intention of the governor to perhaps tap that fund for it? I'm just wondering now where we are in time, real time, when this note was written and the comments were written in December. We're now in January, and it seems like we've got another priority item. Because I would certainly want to see phase 2 completed, and I would encourage that use of funds for that. But where are we with regard to the unappropriated funds and the balance?
Currently, Senator, the Office of Finance and Budgeting is going through the numbers. And right now, I've also stressed to them that the importance of Simon Sanchez completing phase 2 is the top of the list. As they're going through the numbers with the governor of Guam, the war claims has nothing to do with this, the unappropriated funds. It's more the administration would like to pay down the deficit, understood. But there's a shortfall in the Department of Education. There's shortfalls in many agencies.
Right.
The governor can use her transfer authority to cover that. Unfortunately, with DOE, there has been commitments to get to this point. This is where we're at now. And if there is any money available in the unappropriate, this would be the first priority that my office and the Office of Finance Budget will ensure is funded. Everyone else will take the next step when the money is available.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was the answer that I was hoping you would render. Sidus Masi.
If I could add just one more comment, because I like you said, I mean, it is critical to fund phase 3, and once we get there, it's a more higher comfort level. But I also wanted to express that of the money spent on the A&E work, we're currently exploring the options of USDA being involved, either with DOE or with the potential financier. If USDA is involved and that works, there is also the possibility of being refunded the A&E costs. I mean, wrapping it into the long-term financing, and reimbursing us for those upfront costs, so that then can be worked through that the USDA option. So even though we're saying upfront spending, we might have to just spend that money right now. If we are able to get USDA involved, that money then can be refinanced down the road, and the resources be made available for other uses.
Thank you. Senator Paris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Superintendent, for relaying the historical financial situation with Simon Sanchez. I think this is the closest I think we've come to actually getting the school rebuilt, and this is, I feel, is the crux, is we need to get this $2.9 million funded to get the A&E services, and from that point on, I think the formula is there to rebuild the school. So, I do support your efforts in this, and I agree with the chairman that this should be the top priority to get the school on its way to being rebuilt. So you have my full support on this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paris. Senator Therese.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The crux of this, I guess, is BBMR, is determination of whether they have authority to pay deficit versus to pay what the legislature says they should pay with that excess revenues. Although they did send a note that acknowledges that there was a shortfall in the TEF, and that even after they had asked DOE to cut by a certain amount, the shortfall even exceeded that. So the vendors that we're looking at, if I could start with that, Bill, to pay vendors, you need, was it 2 million? 2 million. About 2 million for vendors. These were not, you've not paid these at all since this bill was introduced? I mean, this was not anticipated in the budget?
No, so there's two issues with regard to vendor payables. One is when there's a shortfall in a fiscal year, that doesn't relieve us of those obligations. We just carry those obligations in the next year. So if we are at 2.1 short in this year, and that's in 19, in 20 we know that of our appropriation, 2.1 of that is probably going to need to be used to pay down those past obligations. And that authority is provided by the legislature to go ahead and pay those prior obligations. So, but it means that we end up 2.1, trying to pay those old debts so that we can keep those vendors, in business, especially the smaller vendors, make sure they're able to pay their bills and employees and continue to provide services. The other component is that the way our cash flow works, this is more of an internal thing, but several years ago, the TEF fund was part of the general fund, added to the general fund, made up most of our appropriations. And in the past, DOA had been able to prorate some of that TEF funding early in the fiscal year. For the past couple of years, DOA has said, no, we're not going to pay that out until it's collected, and then we have more certainty as to what's collected, and then we'll pay that out. So, whereas in the past, having some of that upfront TEF money that ends up getting paid back when the property taxes come in, we now have to wait further until February and April until we get those revenues in to be able to draw down those funds. So I guess the two things that happen then is if you're owed, right, we're going to try to pay you, but we're also talking about the first few months of the fiscal year prior to February where we're only getting really enough to pay payroll and then some critical contracts. So it's that critical time for those who are owed, bills that go beyond 60, 90 days. And then when we're in the first part of the fiscal year, GPA is knocking on the door because they don't allow you to extend past 60 days and other critical contracts. So it just really makes the job harder. We do pay. The issue is we're juggling. We're constantly juggling who to pay and how to pay because we want to settle some of the older debts first. And then we also have an eye towards making sure we don't shut schools down, so we can't afford for power or water to go out. And then we have an eye out for our smaller vendors that we know are not positioned to be able to carry that payable or carry that receivable out for too long. So it's a tougher situation in that regard. Once we get to February and April, it gets easier because we get some of that property tax in to kind of catch up. And that's our cycle throughout the year. It's just when we get a shortfall, it just means we carry that obligation forward and have to add that to our list of things to pay. So if I could just really give you an update,
Yes.
Over the beginning of this fiscal year, it's as of January 7th, as of today, we're actually doing pretty well in terms of the overall accounts payable balance, about $6.5 million that we're holding that we have to pay. And sometimes it's between $8 to $12 billion at any one point in time. So from the standpoint of where we are, that's actually a pretty good number, 6 versus higher up to 8 or 10 million outstanding. And part of that reason is we've been forced to do that because the bills are coming in, vendors are threatening to cut off services, so we're pushing and trying to be as timely as possible. But of this amount, as of today, about 60% of that is our payables that are 60 or more days over beyond being due. So while we've been able to reduce the amount for this period in time, what's happening is that some of those vendors who have older payables are not yet able to see relief. And then what we're hoping is that in February, when the property taxes come in, we can start to bring those numbers down as well.
Could you tell us how much of it is from 2019? At the end of 2019, in other words,
Right.
they were short in the collections of TEF during 2019, and so predictably you were unable to pay vendors in 2019. What was that amount?
Right. So so I don't have that right before me, but I know that the accounts. Well, I know we can talk about how short we were on the budget side, but on the payable side, because we had this discussion with the board around I think it was in October, and I could pull that report. But at that time, at the end of closing out the past fiscal year, we hoped to be as current as possible. At that time, we were carrying about $2.6 million of over 60 days. So we normally expect to have things churning at 30 to 60 days, and that's a comfort zone. But beyond 60 days, as we closed out the fiscal year, I believe it was our October board meeting, we were discussing the fact that we had 2.6 kind of outstanding. If that 2.1 had come in, we would be $500,000 outstanding, which would have been much better position for us.
All right, and I just want to make sure we're not overexpending what was appropriated or predicted, but we're just trying to match what was predicted to spend. And so
Right.
if it's 2, that makes sense. All
Right, so the challenge, if we carry that over, then we have to watch our budget and make sure we again, make the adjustments to the fiscal year to not go over the
All
appropriated
right,
amount.
and then, so back to the Simon Sanchez bill, the A&E you're saying is, you've got an estimate already of 4 million?
Well, the estimate is going to be more of an industry standard estimate, and until we get to negotiations and see what the offerers, come to the table with, then we'll get a better number. So hopefully by February, as we work on finalizing and executing a contract, that number will be more concrete as to. But the reason we've estimated 4 million is because, again, with a $5.1 million pledge for the project taken out over 30 years, I think Gita had looked at those numbers and said in the current interest environment, you're looking at a $55 to $65 million total cost for the project. And then if you extrapolate that and say 5 to 10% would be your normal standard
Yes.
A&E costs, we'd be in that $3 to $6 million range. And so I had informed the board that if you give us $4 million, we will move, and we'll be able to move forward with some comfort level that we're in the range of amount of the estimate needed.
All right, can you just remind us if the $55 to $60 million estimate by Gita was that the entire amount that was supposed to go before to the maintenance of the other schools, or that was just the
No, that's the
Simon
amount
Sanchez
that's pledged
portion?
only for Simon Sanchez.
Okay.
So that, remember, Senator Ada
Yes.
had made that change.
Right,
And said
so
we're
he
gonna-
allowed you
yeah.
to really go upwards of 60 million, I think, by those changes, and
Prior
to use the
prior
entire amount.
Right, prior to Senator Ada's amendment,
Mm-hmm.
what was allowed was not only that 5.1, but there were additional revenues that were
Yes.
possible, and that I think the discussion was if you didn't have any restraints on it, you could go as high as $100 million. So the legislature made the change to direct us to do Simon Sanchez first, no other schools until Simon Sanchez was done, and that $5.1 million is basically the cap. We can't go over it. So basically at the
But
end of
that's the entire, I'm just
Yeah.
verifying, that's the entire amount that was going to be
Right.
divided before between Simon Sanchez and other schools.
No, there was a greater amount. So
Okay.
it was 5.1 plus there were additional,
All right, then.
I have to go back, but original revenues that it would generate.
Is the,
So the 5.1, actually, when they looked at the 5.1 only, the estimate was that it would be $55 to $65 million based on whatever interest rate
Okay,
you were
great.
able to obtain.
So that's like your unofficial cap
Cap,
that you're
right,
looking
correct.
at. All right, great. Is there, and you said that you had been able to issue this RFP without this cash, but because the board had pledged to use operations funding if necessary to make sure that RFP. Okay,
Correct.
and I appreciate the efforts of the board in that
I
regard.
think in reviewing our authority that the certification, has to come, when we execute that contract, that certification has
So
to be
you
in
haven't really
place.
certified that these funds are available yet until you execute a contract?
We haven't formally certified it, but we did run it by our budget staff to make sure that we were in the ballpark with existing authorization, that the board had given its authorization so that, we know what we're working with.
All right. And if I could just clarify maybe with the chair, that the money that we're pledging for construction or was pledged by law for construction is actually being used now for operations of the government. Is that correct? So we're going to have a challenge when just to shift again. And, I guess the DOE, we're hoping it's not going to bear the brunt of that, right? But is that correct, that we're currently using that money for
I don't
operations?
know. I know that so the money that's being pledged is coming from the property tax.
Yes.
And especially what was anticipated from the real property valuation, that was the triennial evaluation that was put in place. And of that amount, 5.1 is to be pledged. So that will, and I guess what happens officially is when we get to an agreement with a vendor, a contractor, we execute that pledge and lock it in. But I think you're right. Right now, even though it's set aside and reserved, it may be being used for other purposes.
No, it's
so.
absolutely being used, and
I
that's
don't
the
know.
issue. It's
Well, not
like
for
we
us,
really
but
should, we could easily just amend that to say, instead of just for construction, that we're going to take 4 million upfront, or this year, the 5.1 that was reserved, and start this year. That way you get it for your RFP for the A&E. But I'm afraid it's being used at DOE.
Yeah.
That's what I'm worried about, that pledged amount is actually being used currently for DOE operations, and that we're going to be looking at even greater shortfalls.
Right,
when
if it's
you
TEF
start
funding, then it would be the same
construction.
TEF
Yes.
issues, right?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Therese.
Mr. Chair, may I just ask?
Yes.
If DOA and BBMR are not here again to talk about this deficit that their fiscal note says we should pay instead of using it for Simon Sanchez, and I think that's an issue for us. We can't, get to the bottom of that without them being here to tell us, again, what are the deficit amounts and how does that, is that a priority over this Simon Sanchez? Mr. Chair.
Right, I understand. And I wish they were here, and they've expressed that many occasions. Let's reduce the deficit. I like to know what are their steps, because the unappropriate money was discussed during our budget, that it was supposed to be approximately 27 million, Senator Reese, and it got down to 22, and that's how we were able to protect GMH with 10. We were hoping for that leftover 12, so the other agencies that have a current shortfall, it can cover it, not use the deficit as the reason. Because otherwise, in the budget, I think Senator Teller would have jumped up and said, yes, use the remaining of the unappropriate, specifically in the budget for deficit. That was never brought up. So I'm not going to go backwards in time. I'm going to go forward. And we'll all be listening to them when we talk about the budget in the very near months coming up. Senator Teller, do you have anything?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yeah, that actually, Senator Chalai, thank you, because I was just about to say that with not having them here today, and it's very difficult to go through these bills to not hear the other side of it. Well, that being said, you mentioned earlier, Superintendent, that $1.1 million, well, I thought you said 1.4, but according to your testimony, it's 1.1 million that the governor,
From the governor, right.
was able to provide you, that she promised you to pay. What this 1.1 was to fund the supported project. Was this?
Right. So, in October, Simon Sanchez the students held another meeting with officials because they heard that we were looking to bridge the gap in funding for A&E costs.
Right.
So the governor did
Certainly.
come, and at that meeting, she pledged to provide $1.1 million, and then
For
we
the
since have
A&E.
verified that it's been transferred into the appropriate
Okay.
account.
So and that's for the A&E contract, and that's
A&E,
what
right.
and that's what we're here for today, asking money for that same
remainder.
contract. Okay. Did she happen to tell you where she got that 1.1 million?
I'm not aware. I don't know if our budget staff are aware, but I'm not aware.
Did you ask her? Because if there's a bucket somewhere full of that money, you
Yeah,
could
right.
tell her to pick from the. Okay, so we have a
Okay,
It was from Public Health. Okay, got it. Thank you, Senator Shalahi, for that. In fact, I pulled up this transfer that the governor did recently, paying the same one, paying off, actually, it paid the retirement. And I'm looking at this, it was actually $5 million that were, almost a total of $5 million that was transferred, used from her transfer authority. But it went to
Other agencies.
retirement. I was hoping that maybe some of that money on her transfer authority would have gone directly to that. To Simon Sanchez, in the budget bill that was just recently passed, if I'm not mistaken, it was 500,000 only dedicated directly to Simon Sanchez. It wasn't $1 million, right? It was 500,000.
It's 500, yeah, and we appreciate that, the
Okay.
support. So.
When you went to visit the governor regarding needing the money for the A&D contract, did you ask her for her support for this bill?
I've indicated, I did meet with the chief of staff maybe a month ago, and he had asked about this $2.9 million and was it needed for Simon Sanchez, and I explained that it was needed and that we would be supportive of this bill. I think this is with Tony Babauta. He mentioned that there's still a discussion about the surplus, and I indicated, as we have in our testimony, that the source of funding, we will allow, you and your seats to determine how best to allocate the source of funding, but the 2.9 is real and a need for us to be able to move forward. And I just indicated that Simon Sanchez can't be delayed any further without all of us, really being held accountable for not being able to move this project. So I think that's why the board said use the appropriations that we have, but let's seek that assistance. And if there are other sources of funding available, like you were discussing, we'd appreciate consideration of that.
Well, my only concern is that, we're opening Pandora's box here, utilizing this unappropriated funds. I mean, there are tons of bills that were introduced, wanting to do it, especially ones for our roads. The safety of our roads was out there. And it's kind of concerning unless the governor is going to do the same thing that she did by giving you 1.1 million, find the money, give it to you, and then you're not opening Pandora's box here. There was a part in the Bureau of Budget Management comments that they made, BBMR's comment. And it says here that, however, Public Law 34-116 contained a clause authorizing Guam DOE to utilize any funds not expended by June 30, 2019 for the Simon Sanchez construction to be expended for the operations in FY 2019.
Correct.
How much money did you have left over?
We had the only thing we were able to do was move forward with phase 1, which we used for the land surveying.
But, excuse me, Mr. Fernandez, can you just tell me how much money you had expended first before you go into the explanation?
How much was expended for Simon Sanchez? About 100?
No. It says here.
Oh, okay. So
it authorized you.
Right, and backwards.
To use unexpended funds.
Right. So
okay. How much
of the $1 million, $900,000 was used to cover operations, and the remainder was used to cover the land surveying services.
Okay, so a total amount of unexpended funds that was authorized in Public Law 34-116.
Right.
That total came out to be, how much did you have?
Around 900.
900,000? Okay, and of that 900,000, was any of that money used for the to put aside for the A&E contract?
So of that, at that point, no, it wasn't set aside. We had been asking to bridge the financing. At that point, we were short. Just looking at the end of the fiscal year, we were running about $2.5 million short because of TEF. TEF and other smaller funds.
So you didn't have any unexpended funds.
Right. So
left
we were
over.
unable.
Okay, so you were zero.
Right.
I mean, you were in debt,
Right.
actually deficit.
Correct.
A deficit.
So we had to cover those
nothing.
costs, but we were unable to move forward because we didn't have the remaining funds for the A&E.
Okay, that's my question. Because you mentioned something about 2.6 million from somewhere earlier to
right.
Senator
So
Shalahi's
in terms
question.
of, because the other confusion has been the authorization versus actual cash. So we went back to look at prior authorizations, and in fact, we asked the legislature, to the extent that they could carry it forward or make sure it's usable in 20, that it be made available. So we were able to identify FY18 $1.5 million in authorization. That was, remember the tax amnesty discussion, that there would be funds available to support DOE. Cash never came to support that, but we did ask to bring the authorization forward, and then also the additional $500,000 in the FY20 Appropriations Act. So that's a total of $2 million, and then the remaining $900,000 that we would need to close the 2.9 gap. We asked that the board allow us to use the appropriations from 20 until we found a solution to make us whole.
And last question, Mr. Chair. You mentioned earlier that the total cost of this A&E contract, you won't really know until around February. So you're doing a guesstimate right now on how much that's going to cost. So this 2.9 could actually even be lower than 2.9 or even be more. So you really don't know at this point, at this time, how much it's really going to cost. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay.
So our estimate is just, we try to make it as reasonable as possible based on what we know about the industry and the ratios that are typically used. And so that's where we get this $4 million. But what happens in January 23rd, we will get the proposals in. And of course, as you know, the steps are to identify the highest qualified or bidder, and then enter into negotiations. to finalize a contract. And at that point, we'll have a better sense of whether we're, they're coming in over or under that estimate.
So, you just mentioned something that you're going to go through a bidding process, for this contract, right?
Right, it's an
Well,
RFP.
right now,
right.
an RFP, right? And right now, we're already showing how much money we have when these bidders out there are going to be doing a bid, and they already know the cost. If we give you this money and how much money you have left over, they're going to go, oh, okay, well, legislature's appropriating, $2.9 million, so let's come in at 2.8. They could even be lower. Just doing this, doesn't that jeopardize the bidding?
It's possible that information could be used in putting their offer together. Obviously, we're bound by our, funding abilities, and we would negotiate the most favorable amount. So I think in the past especially before the legislature, where we're here to share that information with you, and we know it'll be public. We have had in the past with the land surveying project a higher estimate than we thought, and it came in significantly under what we had initially anticipated. So we'll work with this process to try to get as favorable amount as possible.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fernandez.
But I think the issue is we're here before the legislature. We're going to share the information with you and as much as you need and want to make the right decisions for us. So
maybe it should have been in closed doors at this point if there's a bidding process out there.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Teller. Senator Kelly.
Sujus Maasi, and thank you for your patience. I know that you sat through our earlier bill, and we appreciate your coming here to provide this information. It's really important to be able to hear as much as possible so that we can weigh these issues out. So we've gotten to hear about why it is that we're in these two situations that we are, about the shortfall in TEF and so forth, that have led up to these situations of not having been able to fully pay these vendors, and how some of the money was utilized for operations that have had some connection to Simon Sanchez. So one of my questions is, with these vendor bills, are there any penalties involved? Will any of this debt that is owed increase as time goes on?
So the answer is yes, and for certain vendors, right? So for instance, if like your utilities would be the most, it would be the most obvious ones, because you get those bills too. If you don't pay, then there's a late fee, and so we would see that with our utilities. Fortunately or unfortunately, it only goes to about 60 days, and then they send you the cutoff notice. So that's when we come knocking on the door to get those paid, and then that's the extent of their late fee. But yes, there is a possibility, depending on the vendor, if a late fee is attached, then it wouldn't be a fee that had to be paid.
Would you mind outlining then some of those vendors that are going to come with some late fees, so that we have an understanding of the types of vendor bills that we're looking at?
So right now, you're absolutely correct, Senator. So right now, I'm currently aware of us paying interest and penalties on our power bill. As far as the rest of our vendors are concerned, we've gone into some payment plans, but they really haven't assessed us fees. So in terms of GPA, we average about $1.1 million in expenses. We've done our earnest to try to keep our payables within 60 to 90 days. Oftentimes we do, because of cash reasons, fall behind. So I think at the highest in our operations, at least as I've seen it in the past, we've paid up to $500,000 in late fees.
Were you saying that you've paid up to $500,000 in late fees? Is that within a single year?
Correct.
Okay, and again, this is information that's really important to hear. Having money go towards late fees or having those accrue is a serious consideration. And we then have to worry about for that $500,000, if that could have gone towards capital improvement projects, if that could be money that could go towards other really pressing needs, like for our hospital or elsewhere, rather than having to try to find it within ourselves. Will this bill, well, let me rephrase that. How would you outline the list of priorities for, especially those for vendors? So where does the payment of vendors sit in your list of priorities? I know that there have to be those hard decisions.
Right. Our first priority is to cover our costs with regard to our payroll. So we pay employees first. So whatever money comes in, we get about 3.65 million a week from DOA, and to about 7 million. That covers our biweekly payroll, and that's our first priority. Anything above that, we would go towards our contractors, our vendors. And so depending on the amount available, what we're looking to ensure is that we are paying what we call our critical contracts. So those are the things that, with regard to health and safety at the school, so your power, your water, your custodial, your food services, those things that you know, if you go without, you risk shutting the school down. Now, does that mean that we pay them all within the 30 days? Some of them are larger companies, and we've worked closely with them. They can absorb some delay in payment, but at some point we have to catch up. So we've been able to work with some of the bigger vendors that if they're able to go for a longer period, let's pay some of the smaller vendors, some of our instructional supply companies and so forth that are here on Guam that can't go beyond that 60-day period without severe consequences. So part of it is, again, a lot of work with the vendors. As you know, there are vendors who don't do business with us because they don't want to do business with Gulf Guam and have to deal with it. But the ones that do and have been able to maintain good relationships is because of that constant give on both sides. So I think in exchange for the government service and contract that they're able to provide, they understand our situation and been many of them have been very I would say they've been working with us. So I think once again, the critical period is really between now and February, where we see the cash flow coming in very thin, and then once property tax comes in, that enables us to catch up, with those vendors who've been waiting for that period of time.
It's also important to hear what you had mentioned earlier, that there are payment plans in place, that you have been working with them to get some compensation to each of them, and that you are working towards this. With this management, and knowing that from year to year, we do our best estimate, the government does its best estimate of understanding what the TEF is going to be, and those other sources of revenue. Can you outline some of the ways that you've looked at these situations and thought about or implemented some cost-cutting measures to try to help deal with this unpredictable fluctuation?
Well, I guess before there, my opinion is that there ought to be a lot more work done on these projections, and maybe more hedging at the appropriations level before all that money is divvied up and given to the agencies to budget against. It's difficult for us to do the projections and to know when we're going to have a good year or a bad year. And when we hear the governor and the legislature debating over the property tax language, what the impact of revaluation will look like, we're really not the experts in that. So asking us to hedge against the projection, I mean, it would be better for us as managers to just project lower so we understand what we're starting the year with. Because if we get to February and March and April and you say, the government says, oh, we're collecting much less, it's very difficult for us to make adjustments. Now, if you're saying hedge against, $2 to $4 million of a shortfall in your budget, what that says to us is, let's just cut our budget by $4 million and see and make the cuts that we can at the beginning of the year, and then see if we get that extra money later on. The problem is most of what we do as an agency is really direct service, during the school year. So telling me I have a surplus in the summer will not be as effective as telling me I have money to hire more teachers or more staff during the course of the entire school year. So it's kind of an interesting revenue source for DOE. Our year starts in August, ends in May or June, and before we were getting prorated amounts of TEF. Now we're saying wait to February or March to see if that funding source comes through. It's a really difficult thing to manage, and I would suggest that as we look at that, either we make cuts at the beginning of the year and just not count on that money coming in, and if that's the case, then it might be that the appropriations language just reflect a lower projected amount from TEF. I think this whole thing of guessing, and especially an agency that's not involved in property tax collections or valuations or appraisals, we're just gonna rely on the experts to tell us, is this gonna be a good year or a bad year? But if you tell me in March or April that we're gonna have a bad year, my year's already done because I've already run the school year, and I don't know what we can do over the summer since most of our costs are already realized by the time we hit May. So it's a cash flow. It's a cash flow puzzle. So.
Right. I've worked at the University of Guam, and I've heard some of these conversations, and then also, the different aspects of the timing and how to deal with all of that in a fiscal year.
Right.
So
I think one of the differences, though, is that if we were able to generate revenue, we were able to generate revenue, or we were able to carry reserves beyond an appropriations year, that might free us up. But if we don't spend money if we don't spend our appropriation, that just goes to the hole at the end of the year. So we don't have that ability to generate revenue to cover us during short months or to carry a reserve from year to year. So those are the two differences between an institution like UOG and DOE. But we would love that opportunity to be able to do so.
So before I move on to some thoughts about revenue generating, so have there been those gatherings together of trying to figure out cost containment measurements, like maybe something as simple as changing the temperature of facilities by a degree or two? I don't know what would be considered an appropriate measure, but it'd be good to hear if there are at least some discussions as to these types of thoughts.
So right now at our current budgetary level, we're maintaining what I would describe as an already reduced footprint from where we were in FY18. So we did the federal tax cuts. We trimmed $12 million off of our spending. There were foregone plans to expand pre-K. We've slowed down the hiring in the central office. We tried to prioritize the schools. We've had to cut contractual services. So we've done that exercise and have tried to maintain at that level. This year, as the legislature, we'll be working with the legislature on trying to figure out how to absorb the extent of the grass cutting services, how to pay out the increments, and how to pay out our teacher reclassification amounts without having a significant amount of new funding to cover those costs. So even though we agree with that direction, what we're really doing is maintaining an already reduced budget and then trying to absorb increases that are that have been reinstated at the policy level. So I think what we're trying to do is maintain. Further cuts, we have a list of further cuts that can be achieved. A lot of those are a little bit more painful, so that's why it's important to know at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year where we're going to be, in order to make those cuts less painful, so we can downsize, staff. Our board members have wanted to look at the necessity of consolidating schools if that becomes, a measure. It's a more extreme measure that gets everybody in kind of an anxious kind of position. But there are other ideas that are out there that we think are ready to move. So we're looking at, I know Senator San Augustine and Vice Speaker Nelson are working on the renewable energy bill to allow us to do solar power in our schools, and we're ready to roll once the legislature moves that. That has two, very good things going for it. One is the ability to generate savings in our utility bills, and then number two is lock up those savings and to be able to finance, facility improvements with what we can save. So instead of adding taxes or raising other fees, we're asking for help in generating more savings. I think that's one bill that's seems ripe, almost ready to go, hopefully. And that once we're able to take that and then use that savings with your consent to lock that away and use that for facility improvements. So things like that I'd love to work on. We're working with GITA on the possibility of leasing out the PD warehouses that we were able to vacate due to our consolidation at Teason. So there are some revenue ideas that are out there, and I have other ideas that we are working on with the board.
Sizuz Maasi for that very detailed answer, and that's precisely what we need to hear. It's very good for us to hear that you've been very thoughtful about this, that you've done your due diligence, that you have those lists ready, but you're also working in a variety of directions. You're working on, like you mentioned, this support of this renewable energy bill. It's a way of lowering costs without negatively impacting the functions. And so all of these things, I think, speak very positively and really support the fact that GDOE has really been trying to work as diligently as possible to have these payment plans in place, to be working on ways of potentially either generating revenue or suggesting being able to carry the reserves, or supporting bills such as this one, the renewable energy bill, and other ideas. These are all really important for us to hear, and important as we weigh in our different considerations. And so I think this also has answered the other question that I had, that if this is not, if the bill doesn't go through, how would it be handled? And I think you've already answered that you have that list ready to go. I mean, of course, we want to provide as much support as we can, but that you also have these other ideas and actions in place to continue to build this potential and these reserves and these opportunities, so that GDOE can continue to build its success back up.
Right, I would say that if this bill doesn't come through, I mean, we actually have a meeting this afternoon with my budget team to kind of go through the lists of what happens if we don't get the additional support. How do we absorb an additional $2.9 million in a shortfall? And the reason is, and it's an important shortfall, because I think we have to come to grips with the fact that Simon Sanchez is, if ignored, is going to become a real safety issue, every year that we aren't able to move forward. So I think with my discussion with the board is we've got to put our money where our mouth is. If we are comfortable with Simon Sanchez, let it go. But if we feel like we need to address it, we have to make the decisions that need to be made in order to make sure that we take care of Simon Sanchez. Now, what those decisions are and the steps are, that's what we're going to be discussing this afternoon, to make sure that our budget is within our budgetary levels. But we're hoping that we can avoid some of those further cuts or reductions, because we've already gone through a large round of cuts, in order and seek the support of the legislature and just making sure that we push this project through. And again, phase 2 is critical. Phase 3 has an assigned amount kind of waiting to be authorized to go forward. So it's really just getting through this design phase. And I think later on it'll be more straightforward.
Sizuz Maasi, again, it's really important to hear these things, because as we're weighing things, it's important for us to be able to understand what the impacts are in that decision.
Right.
The safety of our students is paramount, and that needs to be figured in. So to be able to hear about that is important to have on the record. It's important for the larger community to hear, and important for us, as I said, as we're weighing these things out, so that with these issues about coming up across the possibility of figuring out the priority is, deficit reduction or some other issue, it provides us those tools, and so it's important to hear. So I thank you for sharing them. And before I turn it over to the chair, if there's any others that you think are important for us to understand of something that might have to be cut if one of these two bills or either of these bills don't go forward.
Well, I think mostly I just want to thank you for your support, the committee for its support. And I do know there's a lot of questions that need to be asked when we're talking about expending public resources. But I do hope that the panel and your colleagues also will have faith in the department's management of our financial resources. In the next couple of months, we will be visited by US DOE. We've been pressing them on the improvements that have been made in managing federal funds. We look at that as a potential savings. If we don't have to have a third party, can we take those, that $2.5 million and fund important projects like we're talking about? So we are moving and making the efforts, the improvements needed over our financial management to give assurance to the feds, to you as the legislature, and to the general public that the resources we are given, we're trying to manage as effectively as possible.
And again, that's good to hear. I've gotten to go to some of those meetings when the US DOE came out here, and they mentioned good progress. We discussed, as you said, that once GDOE gets off the high risk and doesn't need that oversight by a third party any longer, that there's that potential to save $2.5 to $3 million a year. And every penny that we can add towards direct instruction and real support and capital improvement projects for our students in our schools and so forth, that's something to really look forward to. So we definitely look forward to that final movement of being able to get off that high-risk status. And I want to thank the chair for allowing me to ask my questions.
You're welcome, Senator Kelly. One short question, really, and then I'll have Senator Sabina Paris would like to ask a follow-up question. But where are we at with the unsolicited bid that DOE received? Maybe you can answer that, because...
Sure. We received an unsolicited proposal from Guam Education Facilities Foundation. Again, it's recognized in procurement law that unsolicited proposals are something that can be utilized, whether on an emergency basis, or if not, you can put out an unsolicited proposal out for competitive bid. So I did, in the course of the time it's taken to try to find the financial solution, the funding solution, we did give that very, very strong consideration, because the benefit of that proposal would have been, a vendor willing to front the costs of the A&E work, complete it, and then be able to be reimbursed on the backside once you're able to secure the long-term financing. So the challenge is that when you award that contract to that entity that's willing to front the cost, they also then have to be able to be the one to award, and to finance the back end, which is, that's the way it's, in order for them to make sure they get paid. So the concept works. It's just that this particular law, the way it's written, we try to, because it's written in a very specific way, kind of foreclose that option. In 58 D105 of the Makahat Act, there's very specific language as to how this gets awarded. And it basically, at the end of the day, we have to award the contract, the leaseback contract, to an offer that offers the lowest annual aggregate leaseback payment, inclusive of the finance capital maintenance costs. So, at this point, we weren't able to have all the, at this point, if we awarded that contract, we believe it would have been in violation of the law, even if it were awarded competitively, because the basis for awarding the financing contract is that they have to have the lowest lease back. So they have to know who's building it, what the cost of construction is. They have to go out and secure their financing. All the things that happen at the tail end, they would have to know up front. So we communicated with them. If this language wasn't in here, and it might have, because this project was very specific. And it was very specific. It was very clear that the legislature wanted to have a clear way of determining the successful bid, by being something that's affordable to the government and not going to be expending $100 million on one school. It was well thought out. It just precluded, this creative financing idea. So we gave it about a month or so of review, and we had a couple conversations to clarify and to express our concern about this, and we were never able to overcome that legal issue. So based on that and the need to move forward, I sent them a letter saying that it was not something we could move forward with, but we welcome their participation in the remainder of the procurement processes for the other work. So in trying to be a short summary, but that's essentially what it was. A creative financing idea. Maybe in other situations it might have worked, but with the specific language in this law, we were unable to figure out how to make that work.
All right, maybe that may work if you're going to build several other schools. That may be something to consider, because at least you know, once Simon Sanchez is done, we can move on. And then if you had a projection that the schools are breaking down in some of the areas, we need another set of schools, then you can consider that.
Well, the idea here was to award a contract based on you do the A&E work and you do the financing.
Yes.
And then later on, you as the entity bid out the construction costs, right? And then so you're now in charge of working with the subcontractor, and so it became a different process than we imagined here.
Yes.
And so it just didn't work with the language here that says we have to make sure we know all those costs up front when we award the contract. So what that means for the process is that we did A&E separate, and then we have to do financing and construction together at the same time. And whoever meets the qualifications and meets the requirement in the law, they're the ones who are going to be competing for the project.
Okay.
And again, lowest annual aggregate lease back. That means whoever can come up with the lowest lease payment that we have to pay for a school that we determine we want, that's the one that's going to be determined to be the successful bidder.
Okay. Senator Sabina, you had follow-up questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in looking at the history of the money that's been set aside for the rebuild of Simon Sanchez, what is the cumulative amount? I know Senator Taitigui was questioning that. So what is the cumulative amount that has been set aside?
So it was $1.5 million in FY18. In FY19, it was $1 million, and then in 20, it's $500,000.
Okay. So that's
so it would have been about $3 million,
okay.
Right?
So I think in
authorization, the only cash we received was for the $1 million in 19. Mm-hmm. We were told that we weren't going to get the cash for 18, and then we're in 20, so we're waiting to see whether we'll get the cash to fund that amount.
So the actual cash, though, so that was appropriated, but the actual allocations were.
But the only cash we received was for the $1 million, because that came from the legislature. We were able to use that to support phase 1, the land surveying. Of the remainder, we had $900,000, which we would have loved to go to A&E costs, but it wasn't enough to move anywhere. We couldn't move forward. It was kind of stuck. And so we ended up having to figure out how to balance our budget in 19, and the language in the law allowed us to use that funding to cover those costs, if we were unable to use it for the A&E work.
So, I mean, I think that's, the issue too is that, the operating costs often takes precedence. But, thinking about, this has been a problem that's been going on for so long. And, I'm thinking that, in order to prioritize this, it's important to make this fund whole by whatever revenues are coming in or whatever, over exceedances that are occurring with the budget. So I think it's important to, would you be willing to pledge any incoming money to make this fund whole? And I was also thinking about a trust fund. so that the money is withheld until the time that there is, you know, the design is done. I think, you know, in kind of holding, you know, holding the government accountable so that the money is there in time of need rather than it being utilized, you know, it evaporates. And, you know, we've been putting this off too long.
Right. Well, I think, well, yes, go ahead.
So, I mean, I think there needs to be more of a lockbox, so to speak, in making sure that these funds are there. And it accumulates so that, you know, it's there. You know, for instance, on this case, the RFP has been solicited. So, you know, we need that money there.
Yeah, I think you're right. And if this had been a, you know, been a thought that happened 2 or 3 years ago, then you could have constructed it that way, to set aside money, to allow for it to carry over, to dedicate it only to a certain purpose. And then I guess there would have to be a thought that at a certain number of years, you would reach the necessary amount needed to go forward with the construction. However, I think if you look backwards, the idea was that this was going to be an all-in-one bid. $5.1 million was already reserved to fund all of it, you know, on a financed basis, but it got caught up in procurement issues. So the issue before was never about how do we come up with upfront money to fund the individual phases. It was only in 2018 where we said we need to break this up because it's become too much of a target for protests. So let's do land surveying, let's do A&E work. And so it was only that time where there was a beginning to say, let's see how we can support those individual phases. But even as in the last appropriations, we were not clear as to what we could carry over, what couldn't carry over. And so I think you're right that, you know, that kind of planning would have been helpful if we had known we would be in a situation. So right now, we're in a different situation, which is by the end of February, if we're successful in negotiating a contract, we have to make that pledge from one source or another if we're going to move forward with that contract. So once we sign that contract, we've certified that funding is set aside. And if it comes from within the DOE budget, so be it. If it comes from the surplus funding, then, you know, even better. But I think my discussion with the board was, you know, number one, the legislature had faith to give it to the department to have this project and make it a top priority. We're here at the beginning of the fiscal year. We don't have all the funding, you know, given to us to do it, but we have to decide whether we're going to get this done or not. And so it was a hard decision, but the board had to say, look, we'll take it out of our current appropriations because we think it's that important. And so, and those consequences we have to face, you know, this fiscal year if no new money or, you know, excess money comes in to make us whole. But by the end of February, you know, that's a targeted date to finish a contract. We should, you know, once we sign that money is set aside and pledged. That's our obligation. So, you know, I guess the issue of keeping a reserve available would be only if we were not able to succeed in getting a contract done. Once that contract's done, that's our first priority because it's one of our contractual obligations.
So at that point, so say the money doesn't come through, I mean, I'm hoping that it does. The idea of the lockbox or the trust fund, that's one way to keep it there so that it's available when an RFP is sent out.
Right. I mean, I think if you look at our dilemma from last year, we face the same dilemma either way. Either it cuts into our operations, we're short on TEF, or we're short on Simon Sanchez, and we have to assess the viability of both, you know, being able to meet both obligations. But I understand your point about setting aside funding. But I do want you to have faith that, you know, we've committed a very difficult solution to getting this done this year. And so, again, if no other source of funding is made available, the board has said to me to make the hard decisions, to make reductions elsewhere in the agency to get Simon Sanchez done. And so with that backup, I call that the backup plan. Plan A is to see if we can use any available other resources to help move Simon Sanchez forward. Because from my communications, it's everyone's priority. I haven't heard any opposition to getting this project done. So that's why I'm hopeful and confident we'll get support to make sure it happens this year.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Fernandez, I just wanted to make sure that you understand that as much as I'm hoping my colleague will support the 228, which is the priority for Simon Sanchez, and even for 233. The only issues that we're going to be faced with is that the audit on the unappropriate money won't be done till about May, but I think you're actually looking more for the assurance.
Yes.
If we were fortunate enough to pass 228 at least, and the governor signs on it, at least you know you'd be on the highest priority to get funds. And I think that's the assurance you're hoping to get.
Correct. We're aware that it's going to have to wait till the audit's completed and that number is certified, but at least we'll know whose door to knock on.
Yes, and also I wanted to make sure that my colleagues and the people of Guam understand that you're looking at other avenues to support the funding of Simon Sanchez, such as grants and other stuff, such as also the relief of being
With USDA's financing and so forth.
and also the the control that they're managing you. Was it the already
The third party? The third party?
Yeah, the third party. Once that's all relieved, it just starts to fix itself. But until then, this assurance is really what the Department of Education is after. Once you get this one and additional funds come in, maybe even Bill 233 may not be needed because you have the funding. We can actually turn to you and says, Mr. Fernandez, can you just pay it with the money you're already getting? It's in your budget. Just pay off your vendors and move on. And could we we can come to that sort of agreement?
It does help us if there is a law out there committing the resources to the department. That definitely will help us in our planning and understanding what our options are in managing the resources.
All right. Thank you, sir. There is no one else to testify on behalf of Bill 233-35 and 228-35. The committee will continue to receive testimony for the next few days. Please address your written testimony to the Committee on General Government Operations and Housing and submit it via email to Senator Joe S. Agustin@gmail.com. Since Masi for your attendance and participation in today's hearing. And for those at home, thank you for watching. The public hearing for Bill 233-35 and Bill 228-35 is now adjourned. It is now 12:14. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a nice day.